Hello, friend. Welcome to the sleepy history world. Tonight, we're stepping back into the quiet kitchens of the 1950s to uncover a forgotten secret that rarely makes it into history books. Long before calorie, counting apps, trendy diets, or miracle weight loss plans, many women stayed naturally slim through simple everyday meals that hardly anyone talks about today. There were no expensive superfoods, no protein shakes, and no complicated nutrition rules. Just humble breakfasts, comforting soups, fresh vegetables, homemade bread, and routines that quietly shaped an entire generation. But what exactly were these unspoken foods? And why did they seem to work so well? As we slowly explore the peaceful rhythm of a typical 1950s kitchen, you may be surprised to discover that the biggest secret wasn't hidden in one magical ingredient at all. Before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing history stories like this, do subscribe for daily videos and join our growing community. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's gently travel back to a simpler time where every ordinary meal tells an extraordinary story. Picture a kitchen where the morning begins, not with the buzz of notifications or the glow of a smartphone, but with the gentle whistle of a kettle, the clink of ceramic dishes, and the smell of toast slowly browning beneath a watchful eye. Welcome back to Sleepy History World, where tonight we travel into an ordinary 1950s kitchen to uncover a surprisingly fascinating question. What were the quiet everyday foods that helped many women remain remarkably slim without calorie, counting apps, protein powders, or trendy diets? The answer may be far less dramatic than you expect. It is hidden not in miracle ingredients, but in humble meals, careful habits, smaller portions, and a way of eating that has almost disappeared. As we settle into this peaceful journey through history, you may notice that the meals seem simple, even plain by modern standards. Yet behind every slice of homemade bread, every bowl of vegetable soup, and every carefully prepared dinner lies a story about post-war life, family routines, food shortages that had only recently ended, and kitchens built around patience instead of convenience. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and if you enjoy relaxing journeys into the forgotten details of history, be sure to subscribe for more peaceful stories like this. Now let us quietly step back into the gentle rhythm of a 1950s day. For many women living during the 1950s, staying slim was rarely the result of following a formal weight loss program. Instead, it was simply a natural outcome of the foods that filled the pantry and the daily routines that surrounded every meal. Breakfast often began modestly. A bowl of oatmeal simmered slowly on the stove, flavored with a small spoonful of brown sugar or perhaps a drizzle of honey if the family could spare it. Sometimes there was a single fried egg, one slice of buttered toast, and a glass of milk. Cold cereals certainly existed, but they were far less sugary than many varieties found today. Portions were modest because cereal boxes were smaller, bowls were smaller, and eating until completely full was not considered necessary. Fresh fruit appeared whenever it was in season. An apple might be sliced and shared among children, while oranges were enjoyed as a simple treat rather than transformed into juice loaded with extra sugar. Bananas, peaches, pears, and berries followed the rhythm of local harvests. Refrigerated trucks and global imports had not yet made every fruit available throughout the entire year, so families naturally ate what nature provided during each season. This seasonal eating quietly limited excess while adding variety throughout the year. One forgotten food that quietly filled countless kitchens was homemade vegetable soup. Large pots simmered for hours, using carrots, onions, celery, potatoes, cabbage, tomatoes, beans, and whatever vegetables remained from the week's shopping. Nothing was wasted. Vegetable scraps became broth. Leftover meat bones flavored the soup, and stale bread accompanied each bowl. The soup was filling without containing enormous amounts of fat or sugar. Warm liquid naturally slowed eating, giving the body time to recognize fullness before anyone reached for another serving. Cottage cheese was another surprisingly common staple. Today it appears mostly in diet plans, but during the 1950s it was simply an ordinary food. Women enjoyed it with sliced peaches, pineapple, tomatoes, or crisp lettuce. It provided satisfying protein without requiring enormous portions. There was no need for protein bars or expensive supplements, when simple dairy products already served that purpose. Salads looked very different from many restaurant versions today. They were not buried beneath mountains of cheese, bacon, fried chicken, or creamy dressings. Instead, lettuce, cucumber, radishes, carrots, celery, tomatoes, and green onions were lightly dressed with vinegar and a small amount of oil. Sometimes a boiled egg completed the meal. Other times leftover chicken or tuna provided enough protein to satisfy without excess. The vegetables occupied most of the plate while richer foods remained only a small addition. Double-hull potatoes deserve special attention because they have been unfairly blamed in many modern diets. During the 1950s, potatoes were served boiled, baked, or mashed with only moderate amounts of butter. They were filling because they contained fiber and water, encouraging satisfaction long before overeating became likely. French fries certainly existed, but they were not eaten every day and rarely arrived in oversized portions. Beans quietly supported many family meals. Navy beans, kidney beans, lima beans, split peas, and lentils stretched household budgets while providing lasting energy. A bowl of bean soup or baked beans alongside vegetables could satisfy an entire family for surprisingly little cost. These humble legumes digested slowly, helping reduce constant hunger throughout the afternoon. Homemade bread was another forgotten difference. Although white bread remained popular, many families still baked loaves at home or purchased fresh bread from local bakeries. Without the long ingredient lists common today, bread often contained only flour, yeast, salt, water, and perhaps a little sugar or shortening. Thick slices were unnecessary because every piece felt substantial and satisfying. Perhaps one of the greatest differences involved beverages. Water accompanied many meals. Milk appeared regularly. Coffee and tea were enjoyed with modest amounts of sugar. Soft drinks existed, but remained occasional treats instead of daily companions. Fruit juice was consumed in smaller glasses because whole fruit was usually considered the better option. Simply avoiding large quantities of liquid sugar quietly reduced daily calorie intake, without anyone needing to think about it. Dessert certainly existed, despite modern myths suggesting people rarely enjoyed sweets. Apple pie, peach cobbler, rice pudding, homemade cookies, and simple cakes regularly appeared on family tables. The remarkable difference lay in frequency and portion size. Dessert usually followed Sunday dinner, birthdays, holidays, or special occasions rather than appearing after every meal. A single slice satisfied because treats remained genuinely special. Butter was used carefully. Contrary to modern assumptions, many women did not drown vegetables in butter or cream. A small pat flavored an entire serving. Bacon grease sometimes seasoned vegetables, but only a spoonful stretched across several portions. Expensive ingredients encouraged careful use rather than excess. Fish quietly occupied an important place in many households, especially on Fridays. Baked cod, salmon, tuna casserole, sardines, on crackers, or simple fish cakes offered nutritious meals that were satisfying without feeling especially heavy. Canned tuna mixed with celery and a modest amount of mayonnaise became an easy lunch that could feed several people. One forgotten habit involved eating slowly because meals required conversation. Families gathered around the table with the television turned off, if they owned one at all. Children discussed school, fathers described work, and mothers shared neighborhood news. Conversation naturally stretched meals, allowing fullness to develop before anyone rushed toward second helpings. Snacking happened far less frequently than today. Kitchens contained fewer ready-to-eat packaged foods. If someone became hungry between meals, the available choices were often an apple, carrot sticks, leftover soup, or perhaps a slice of bread with peanut butter. There were no endless shelves of chips, candy bars, flavored crackers, energy drinks, or frozen desserts calling for attention every few hours. Cooking itself demanded movement. Flour had to be measured, vegetables peeled, dough kneaded, dishes washed by hand, and groceries carried home. Every meal required standing, walking, lifting, stirring, scrubbing, and cleaning. These quiet activities added gentle physical effort throughout the day, complementing the naturally balanced meals. Many women also grew herbs and vegetables in backyard gardens. Tomatoes ripened on vines, beans climbed wooden poles, lettuce filled small patches of soil, and fresh parsley waited outside the kitchen door. Garden vegetables often reached the dinner table within minutes of harvesting, preserving both flavor and nutrients, while reducing dependence on processed foods. Seasonal preservation became another forgotten tradition. Women canned peaches, tomatoes, green beans, pears, applesauce, and pickles during harvest season. Shelves filled with colorful jars that provided wholesome food throughout the winter. Because preserving food required time and care, families appreciated every jar and wasted very little. Perhaps the most overlooked food was simply homemade stew. Beef, carrots, onions, potatoes, peas, celery, and broth simmered together for hours, until every ingredient became tender. One bowl offered protein, vegetables, and satisfying warmth without encouraging overeating. Slow cooking transformed inexpensive ingredients into deeply comforting meals. Eggs appeared throughout the week because they were affordable, versatile, and nourishing. Scrambled eggs with tomatoes, boiled eggs in salads, omelets filled with vegetables, or poached eggs on toast provided satisfying meals without unnecessary complexity. They demonstrated that nutritious food did not need elaborate preparation. Cheese was enjoyed, but moderation remained the quiet rule. Thin slices accompanied sandwiches or crackers instead of covering entire casseroles. Flavor mattered more than quantity. The same principle applied to cream, gravy, and sauces, which enhanced meals without overwhelming them. Dinner usually followed a familiar pattern. A modest portion of meat rested beside generous servings of vegetables, potatoes, or rice, and perhaps a slice of bread. As evening slowly settled across neighborhoods, lined with tidy homes and carefully trimmed lawns, another quiet pattern appeared inside the kitchen. Supper was rarely rushed. Unlike the hurried meals many people experience today, dinner in the 1950s often had a predictable rhythm. Vegetables were washed by hand, potatoes peeled with a simple metal peeler, onions chopped on a wooden board worn smooth after years of use, and meat carefully portioned so there would be enough for everyone at the table, even when families enjoyed roast beef, pork chops, or fried chicken. The meat was usually only one part of the meal rather than the entire focus. Plates were filled with carrots, green beans, cabbage, peas, beets, or corn, creating a balance that quietly limited excess without anyone speaking about calories. One forgotten habit involved leftovers. Very little food was thrown away. Yesterday's roast chicken became today's sandwich. Remaining vegetables disappeared into soup. Extra mashed potatoes turned into potato cakes, lightly browned in a skillet. Small pieces of ham-flavoured bean soup for several days. Because families reused nearly everything, meals remained practical rather than extravagant. This habit naturally prevented the constant purchasing of highly processed convenience foods that now fill supermarket shelves. Another common food was plain yogurt. Although it was not nearly as sweet as many varieties available today, when yogurt appeared, it was often served with fresh fruit or a small spoonful of homemade preserves instead of colourful candies or sugary syrups. The taste was gentle and simple, allowing the fruit itself to provide most of the sweetness. Many women also relied on cooked cereals beyond oatmeal, cream of wheat, cornmeal mush, and other warm porridges appeared regularly during colder months. These breakfasts were inexpensive, filling and satisfying for hours afterward. Because they digested gradually, they reduced the urge to snack before lunchtime. Children and adults alike often started their day with these humble bowls, topped only with a little butter or a sprinkle of cinnamon. Cabbage deserves special mention because it quietly appeared in countless meals. It became coleslaw with a light vinegar dressing, simmered gently alongside carrots, or filled hearty soups during winter. Rich in fibre and inexpensive to purchase, cabbage stretched household budgets, while helping meals feel generous without becoming overly rich. Many families hardly considered it remarkable because it was simply an ordinary vegetable found in nearly every grocery store. Seasonal berries offered another natural sweetness. Strawberries in early summer, blackberries gathered from country lanes, raspberries grown in backyard gardens, and blueberries picked from local farms brought colour to the table for only a short time each year. Families looked forward to these harvests because they understood that fresh berries would not remain available forever. This seasonal anticipation made simple fruit feel like a genuine luxury. Apples held a special place throughout the year. They required no preparation, travelled well, and stayed fresh for weeks in cool storage. A woman heading to the market or caring for children at home could simply reach for an apple instead of a packaged snack. The crisp fruit satisfied hunger with natural sweetness and fibre, while requiring no advertising to convince anyone of its value. Nuts also appeared occasionally, particularly during holidays or colder months. Walnuts, pecans, peanuts and almonds were eaten in modest handfuls rather than giant bags. Because nuts were relatively expensive, they were appreciated rather than consumed mindlessly. A small serving often lasted an entire evening. The pantry itself looked remarkably different from what many people would recognize today. Shelves held flour, rice, dried beans, oats, canned tomatoes, spices, baking powder, cocoa, tea, coffee, vinegar, and jars of preserved vegetables. There were far fewer brightly coloured boxes promising instant meals or miracle health benefits. Most ingredients required actual cooking, and that simple fact slowed eating habits throughout the week. Sugar certainly occupied the kitchen cupboard. but it was treated as an ingredient rather than a food by itself. It sweetened cakes, cookies, jams, and special desserts. Yet few people poured large amounts into every drink throughout the day. Sweetness remained something to enjoy, occasionally rather than constantly. Many women prepared gelatin salads, a popular trend during the decade. Although these dishes may seem unusual today, many versions included fruit, vegetables, cottage cheese, or other simple ingredients. While some recipes contained whipped cream or marshmallows for celebrations, everyday versions were often lighter than modern desserts and served in surprisingly modest portions. Another forgotten feature of the 1950s kitchen was patience. Bread dough rose slowly beneath a clean towel. Soup simmered for hours. Stews filled the house with comforting aromas long before dinner arrived. Rice cooked gently on the stove instead of emerging from a microwave within minutes. This slower pace meant meals were planned well in advance, reducing the temptation to rely on fast food or impulse purchases. Fast food itself was still a novelty for much of the population. While hamburger restaurants existed, visiting one remained an occasional outing rather than a daily convenience. Families generally expected to prepare meals at home, because that was simply how life worked. The idea of ordering dinner through a phone application would have sounded almost unbelievable. Portion sizes quietly reflected this slower lifestyle. Plates were noticeably smaller than many used today. Drinking glasses held fewer ounces. Dessert bowls were delicate rather than oversized, and serving spoons encouraged moderation. No one needed to invent special portion. Controlled dishes, because ordinary household tableware already limited excessive servings. Advertising also promoted different expectations. Although food companies certainly marketed their products, there was far less constant encouragement to snack every hour. Commercials promoting giant buckets of soda, towering burgers, endless refills, or family-sized bags of chips had not yet become a permanent part of everyday life. Without endless reminders to eat, people naturally waited until genuine hunger arrived. Even celebrations demonstrated moderation. Birthday cakes were homemade, sliced carefully, and shared among family and friends. Ice cream remained a beloved treat, but a single scoop in a small dish often felt completely satisfying. Holidays certainly featured rich meals, yet those occasions stood apart from ordinary weekdays, making them memorable rather than routine. Many women also drank homemade broths during colder months. Chicken broth, beef broth, or vegetable broth warmed the body while providing nourishment between meals if someone felt under the weather. These comforting liquids contained far less sodium and far fewer additives than many canned varieties available decades later. Simple sandwiches became another everyday favorite. Thin slices of turkey, roast beef, ham, or egg salad rested between two slices of bread alongside lettuce or tomato. There were no towering sandwiches stacked with multiple layers of cheese, bacon, fried onions, and oversized sauces. Lunch remained practical, because afternoon responsibilities still waited. The neighborhood itself quietly supported healthier habits. Walking to nearby shops, carrying groceries home, hanging laundry outdoors, gardening, sweeping porches, and visiting neighbors all required gentle movement throughout the day. Food and physical activity existed together so naturally that few people thought of exercise as something requiring a separate membership or scheduled workout. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden within these forgotten foods is that none of them promised dramatic transformations. There were no labels claiming instant weight loss, no celebrity endorsements, no detox drinks, and no expensive subscription plans. Women simply prepared ordinary meals from ordinary ingredients, repeated familiar routines, and trusted habits that had been passed from one generation to the next. Of course, life in the 1950s was not perfect. Nutritional knowledge was still developing. Smoking was unfortunately common, and many households relied on recipes that modern health experts would improve. Yet despite these limitations, the everyday pattern of eating remained surprisingly balanced. Meals centered on real food, portions stayed reasonable, sugary treats remained occasional pleasures, and home cooking dominated daily life. As the kitchen lights dimmed and the final dishes dried on their rack beside the sink, another ordinary day quietly came to an end. Tomorrow would likely begin with another simple breakfast, another carefully prepared lunch, and another family dinner shared around the same familiar table. No one imagined they were following a lifestyle that future generations would study with curiosity. They were simply living within the rhythms of their time, nourished by humble foods that asked for little more than patience, gratitude, and the willingness to enjoy one simple meal at a time. As the seasons quietly changed, so did the foods that appeared on the family table. Spring brought crisp lettuce, tender asparagus, fresh peas, and young carrots pulled from backyard gardens. Summer overflowed with tomatoes still warm from the afternoon sun, cucumbers fresh from the vine, sweet corn wrapped in green husks, and peaches whose juice dripped down your hands with every bite. Autumn filled kitchens with apples, pumpkins, squash, cabbage, and root vegetables that could be stored through the colder months. Winter meals became heartier, with stews, soups, baked potatoes, dried beans, and preserved fruits carefully canned during the previous harvest. Without realizing it, families naturally ate a wide variety of foods throughout the year, giving their bodies a changing mix of nutrients without chasing the latest health trend. A surprisingly common evening snack was simply a glass of warm milk. Instead of reaching for bags of chips or sugary desserts while watching television, many women ended the day with something gentle and comforting. The warm milk often helped signal that the day's eating had come to an end. Once the kitchen was cleaned, cupboards were closed until breakfast, late night snacking, now so common in many households, simply was not part of everyday life for most families. Even sandwiches reflected a different philosophy. Bread was sliced thinner, spreads were applied lightly, and fillings remained modest. A tomato sandwich with a little mayonnaise, an egg salad sandwich made from 1 or 2 eggs, or a slice of roast beef with mustard was considered perfectly satisfying. There was little desire to pile ingredients higher and higher. Simplicity was not viewed as deprivation, it was simply normal. Chewing slowly also played an unexpected role. Meals took time because conversation naturally filled the pauses. Children were expected to remain seated until everyone had finished eating. Mothers rarely stood up every few minutes to grab forgotten items, because most of the meal had already been carefully prepared before anyone sat down. Without distractions from phones, tablets, or endless television programs, people paid attention to the food in front of them and to one another. Fullness had time to develop naturally before another serving was considered. Many women also baked at home several times each week. At first glance, this might seem surprising, especially when discussing staying slim. Fresh bread, pies, cookies, and cakes certainly emerged from home ovens. But the key difference was frequency and freshness. Homemade baked goods contained recognizable ingredients and were usually enjoyed shortly after they were made. Once they were gone, they were gone. There was no endless supply waiting in brightly colored packages With months, long shelf lives, baking required effort, planning, and time, making sweets a meaningful occasion, rather than a constant convenience. Lone overlooked food was plain popcorn. Long before microwave bags covered in artificial flavorings became popular, popcorn was often prepared in a pot on the stove. A small amount of oil, a handful of kernels, and a sprinkle of salt created a light snack that felt generous because of its volume. Even though it contained relatively few calories compared with many processed snacks available today. Women also understood the value of stretching ingredients. A single chicken might feed a family for several meals. The roasted meat appeared on the first evening. Leftover slices became sandwiches. The next day, the bones simmered into broth, which later transformed into chicken soup filled with vegetables and noodles. Every part served a purpose. This careful approach reduced waste while encouraging balanced meals built around wholesome ingredients. Breakfast rarely included desserts, disguised as morning food. Pancakes, waffles, and sweet pastries certainly appeared, especially on weekends, but weekday breakfasts remained practical. Oatmeal, eggs, toast, fruit, or simple cereal dominated the morning table. Starting the day with large amounts of sugar was far less common than it is in many places today. Fresh herbs quietly added flavor without adding excess richness. Parsley, dill, thyme, rosemary, sage, and chives often grew just outside the kitchen door. A handful of chopped herbs transformed simple vegetables or soups into flavorful dishes, reducing the need for heavy sauces. Nature itself supplied much of the seasoning. Markets looked different as well. Grocery stores were smaller, offering fewer choices for each product. Instead of facing dozens of breakfast cereals or hundreds of frozen meals, shoppers selected from a relatively limited range of familiar foods. Ironically, having fewer choices often made shopping simpler. Women purchased what the family needed, instead of being surrounded by endless tempting options designed to encourage impulse buying. Many mothers packed lunches from home rather than purchasing meals during the day. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, a small homemade cookie, and perhaps a thermos of soup created a balanced meal that was both affordable and filling. These packed lunches reflected careful planning rather than last-minute convenience. Another forgotten habit involved respecting hunger. Meals were not automatically eaten out of boredom. Household chores filled much of the day, leaving little time for wandering into the kitchen simply because there was nothing else to do. If someone felt hungry shortly before dinner, they were often encouraged to wait because the evening meal would soon be ready. Learning to distinguish genuine hunger from passing cravings became part of everyday life without anyone using those exact words. Even restaurant visits followed different expectations. Dining out was often reserved for birthdays, anniversaries, or special celebrations. Portions were satisfying but not enormous, and taking home large boxes of leftovers was much less common because serving sizes were already moderate. A restaurant meal felt like an event rather than a routine solution to a busy evening. Food packaging itself offered fewer temptations. Bright cartoon characters, oversized promotional offers, and constant advertisements aimed at encouraging children to snack throughout the day had not yet reached the intensity seen decades later. The kitchen remained a place for preparing meals rather than storing endless varieties of packaged treats. Many women also practiced careful meal planning, simply because household budgets demanded it. Every purchase mattered. Shopping lists were written before leaving home, helping avoid unnecessary spending. This thoughtful approach naturally reduced impulse purchases of sweets and highly processed foods. Perhaps one of the most remarkable differences was the absence of constant guilt surrounding food. Women certainly cared about maintaining a healthy figure, especially given the fashion standards of the era, but most were not surrounded by thousands of conflicting nutritional opinions every single day. There were no social media influencers recommending a different miracle diet every week. Meals were judged less by labels and more by common sense, family tradition, and practicality. By the end of the decade, convenience foods slowly began appearing in greater numbers, promising to save precious time in the kitchen. Frozen dinners, boxed cake mixes, canned sauces, and packaged desserts became increasingly popular. While many families welcomed these innovations, they also marked the beginning of a gradual shift away from the slower, home-centered cooking traditions that had quietly shaped generations before them. Looking back now, it becomes clear that the secret was never hidden inside one extraordinary ingredient. There was no magical berry, miracle grain, or forgotten spice responsible for keeping so many women slim. The true secret was woven through an entire way of life. A kitchen filled with real ingredients, meals prepared from scratch, vegetables appearing every day, desserts enjoyed in moderation, portions that respected hunger instead of exceeding it, and routines that valued patience over speed. In many ways, those quiet kitchens remind us that healthy eating once looked wonderfully ordinary. It smelled like soup simmering on the stove for hours. It sounded like vegetables being chopped on a wooden cutting board and bread being sliced for tomorrow's lunch. It looked like modest plates shared around a table where conversation mattered more than entertainment. These simple, unspoken foods were never marketed as revolutionary. Yet together, they created a way of eating that nourished families, satisfied appetites, and quietly supported healthy body weights through habits so ordinary that few people of the time ever imagined they would one day become a fascinating piece of history. As the final years of the 1950s unfolded, another quiet habit continued almost unnoticed. Many women learned to judge food not by numbers printed on a label, but by experience. They knew roughly how much flour would fill a loaf pan, how many potatoes would satisfy a family of 5, and how much soup remained after everyone had eaten. Measuring cups existed, of course, but much of cooking came from memory and repetition. This familiarity created meals that were remarkably consistent. Portions rarely drifted larger year after year because recipes were handed down through generations and prepared in much the same way each time. Breakfast tables often included something as simple as stewed fruit. Apples, pears, peaches, or prunes were gently cooked until soft, naturally sweet. These fruits provided warmth during cold mornings and offered sweetness without relying on heavily processed ingredients. Children often enjoyed them before school, while mothers appreciated how inexpensive they were to prepare in larger batches. Rice also played a modest but important role in many households. It was served plain beside vegetables and meat, folded into casseroles, or simmered into creamy rice pudding for dessert. Unlike many modern rice dishes loaded with butter, cream, or rich sauces, plain rice quietly absorbed the flavors of the meal. Without becoming the center of attention, it filled hungry stomachs while keeping meals affordable and balanced. A visit to the neighborhood bakery revealed another interesting difference. Fresh bread was often purchased daily or every few days because it did not contain preservatives that allowed it to stay soft for weeks. If bread became stale, it was transformed into breadcrumbs, bread pudding, stuffing, or thick slices of toast. Nothing was considered useless simply because it had become a day old. Homemade applesauce was another common sight. During apple season, large pots simmered with peeled apples, cinnamon, and just enough sugar to enhance the fruit is natural sweetness. Once cooled, jars lined pantry shelves, ready to accompany breakfast or dinner throughout the coming months. Children happily ate applesauce as a treat, unaware that they were enjoying something far simpler than many modern packaged desserts. Even the smell of a 1950s kitchen tells part of the story. Instead of the scent of artificial flavorings or microwaved meals, the air carried aromas of onions gently browning in a skillet, bread rising beneath a cloth, cinnamon drifting from the oven, and vegetables slowly cooking in homemade broth. These smells reflected time invested in preparation, reminding everyone that satisfying food rarely needed to appear instantly. Many women also understood the value of broth-based meals during difficult financial periods. If money was tight before payday, soup became even more important. Extra vegetables, a handful of barley, leftover chicken, or dried beans stretched into meals that could feed everyone comfortably. These simple recipes demonstrated remarkable creativity without sacrificing nourishment. Children growing up during this era often accepted vegetables because they appeared so frequently. Green beans, spinach, carrots, beets, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts were ordinary parts of dinner. While not every child welcomed them with excitement, vegetables were expected rather than negotiated. They belonged on the dinner plate just as naturally as bread or potatoes. Lone forgotten custom involved preserving fresh herbs by hanging them to dry. Bundles of sage, thyme, oregano, and mint dangled in warm kitchens until completely dry, ready to flavor soups and roasted vegetables during winter. This simple practice allowed families to enjoy fresh flavors long after the growing season had ended. Sunday dinners carried special importance. The meal might include roasted meat, mashed potatoes, gravy, fresh vegetables, homemade rolls, and pie for dessert. Yet even on these generous occasions, overeating was not usually encouraged. Family members often lingered around the table talking long after the meal had ended, allowing satisfaction to settle naturally instead of rushing immediately toward additional servings. Coffee breaks looked different as well. Rather than stopping for oversized specialty drinks loaded with whipped cream and flavored syrups, many women simply enjoyed a small cup of black coffee or coffee with a little milk. If something sweet accompanied it, the treat was usually modest, a single cookie or a thin slice of cake shared with friends during an afternoon visit. Even grocery shopping encouraged moderation. Most families shopped only once or twice each week, because frequent trips consumed valuable time and fuel. Since food needed to last until the next shopping day, meals were carefully planned and ingredients thoughtfully used. Impulse purchases became less common, simply because shopping itself was less frequent. The refrigerator also contained fewer distractions. Opening the door revealed milk, eggs, butter, leftovers, fresh vegetables, and perhaps homemade desserts prepared earlier in the week. There were far fewer bottles of sugary beverages, flavored yogurts, processed snacks, or ready-made meals, waiting to tempt someone every time the door opened. Many women learned recipes directly from their mothers and grandmothers, rather than from glossy cookbooks or television personalities. These recipes emphasize practicality. They were designed to feed families well, avoid waste, and make the most of seasonal ingredients. Health was not always discussed using modern scientific language, yet generations of experience quietly shaped balanced meals. There was also a deep appreciation for simple flavors. Fresh tomatoes tasted like tomatoes. Carrots retained their natural sweetness. Butter was enjoyed because it was real butter, not because it appeared in excessive amounts. A ripe peach required no additional syrup. Much of the satisfaction came from allowing ingredients to speak for themselves, rather than covering every bite with layers of seasoning and sauces. As evening drew to a close, the kitchen slowly returned to silence. Leftovers were covered carefully, tomorrow's lunch ingredients were prepared, and dishes were stacked neatly inside cupboards. There was a comforting sense that the day's work had been completed. Eating had served its purpose, nourishing the family without dominating every waking thought. When historians look back at these kitchens today, they often discover that the greatest difference was not a single forgotten food but a forgotten rhythm. Women cooked because that was part of caring for the household. Families gathered because meals brought everyone together. Ingredients were respected because they represented both hard work and precious household income. Hunger arrived, meals answered it, and life moved forward until the next mealtime. Perhaps that is why these unspoken foods continue to fascinate us. They remind us that good health was once built quietly, one ordinary meal after another. A bowl of oatmeal on a cool morning, vegetable soup shared on a rainy afternoon, a crisp apple picked in autumn, a baked potato beside roasted carrots, a slice of homemade bread still warm from the oven. None of these foods promised miraculous results, yet together, repeated day after day and year after year, they created a way of eating that felt natural, satisfying, and remarkably sustainable. The women who prepared these meals would probably be surprised to learn that future generations would search for the secret behind their kitchens. They might simply smile, wipe their hands on a well-worn apron, and point toward the dinner table where a modest meal of real food, shared with family and enjoyed without hurry, quietly offered an answer that had been there all along. Yet there was another quiet reason these foods seemed to work so well, one that had very little to do with the ingredients themselves. Meals followed the clock instead of emotions. Breakfast came after the morning chores had begun. Lunch arrived around midday. Dinner was served in the early evening, and after the dishes were washed, the kitchen was effectively closed. This predictable rhythm gave the body time to feel hungry before the next meal. There was little expectation of grazing from sunrise until bedtime. Hunger was not viewed as an emergency, but as a natural signal that another meal would soon arrive. Many women also developed an instinct for balancing richer foods with lighter ones. If Sunday dinner included roast beef and gravy, Monday might feature vegetable soup and sandwiches. If a birthday celebration meant enjoying cake and ice cream, the following day's meals quietly returned to ordinary fare, without guilt or elaborate attempts to make up for the indulgence. Balance happened naturally over the course of the week, rather than being calculated meal by meal. Simple breakfasts often included leftovers from the previous evening, something that may seem unusual today. A boiled potato, a slice of roast meat, or a serving of vegetables could easily appear on the breakfast plate alongside eggs or toast. The idea that breakfast required specially marketed foods had not yet taken hold in many homes. Good food was simply good food regardless of the hour. Another forgotten staple was baked apples. During cooler months, apples were cored, sprinkled lightly with cinnamon, and baked until tender. Sometimes a few raisins were added, or a tiny amount of brown sugar if the apples were particularly tart. The result felt comforting enough to serve as dessert, yet it remained built almost entirely around fruit. Fish was often prepared in wonderfully uncomplicated ways. A piece of cod, dusted with flour, and lightly pan, fried, salmon baked with lemon, or mackerel, served with boiled potatoes, created meals that were nourishing without unnecessary richness. Fresh parsley or dill might be sprinkled over the top, adding freshness without overwhelming the natural flavour. Even sandwiches reflected careful planning. Lettuce leaves were crisp because they had been washed only moments before serving. Tomatoes were sliced thick during summer, when they were at their sweetest. Cheese was cut into thin slices instead of thick blocks, allowing its flavour to spread throughout the sandwich without requiring large amounts. Every ingredient had a purpose. Many households also kept bowls of fresh fruit sitting in plain view on the kitchen table. Apples, oranges, pears, or bananas became the easiest choice. Whenever someone wanted a small snack, there was no need for colourful wrappers or clever marketing. Nature itself provided attractive packaging. The weekly grocery budget influenced nearly every decision. Waste was considered almost unthinkable. Vegetable peels sometimes enriched the compost pile. Stale bread became stuffing. Bacon fat was saved carefully in a small container for cooking, and leftover gravy flavoured tomorrow's potatoes. This respect for food encouraged thoughtful eating because every ingredient represented both time and money. The freezer, if a family owned one, looked very different from modern versions. Instead of rows of frozen pizzas, desserts, and ready-made dinners, it often held frozen vegetables from the garden, carefully wrapped cuts of meat, homemade bread, or berries preserved during summer. Freezing served as a way to extend the harvest rather than replace cooking. Children learned many of these habits simply by watching. They saw vegetables being washed, dough being kneaded, soup stirred, and fruit preserved in glass jars. Cooking skills were not separate hobbies but ordinary parts of daily life. By the time many girls reached adulthood, they already understood dozens of recipes because they had quietly observed them for years. Another overlooked food was plain-baked squash, whether it was acorn squash, butternut squash, or pumpkin prepared as a side dish rather than a pie. These naturally sweet vegetables provided satisfying meals during autumn and winter. A small amount of butter and a pinch of cinnamon were often all they needed. Tea occupied an important place during quiet afternoons. A cup of black tea with a splash of milk might accompany a brief visit from a neighbour or provide a peaceful break after household chores. Unlike today's oversized sweetened beverages, tea was usually enjoyed in modest cups, encouraging conversation more than consumption. One detail that often surprises historians is how rarely people wasted their appetites on drinks. Calories generally came from food rather than beverages. Water, milk, tea, and coffee dominated everyday life. Sweet drinks remained occasional pleasures rather than constant companions carried throughout the day. The family dining table also shaped eating habits in subtle ways. Everyone generally received their plate at the same time. Children waited politely until everyone was seated before beginning. Meals had a clear beginning and a clear ending. Once dinner concluded, plates were cleared, leftovers stored, and the kitchen cleaned. Without endless opportunities to continue nibbling, satisfaction gradually replaced hunger until the next meal. Fresh eggs from backyard chickens were common in many rural communities. Their rich golden yolks reflected the birds' varied diets, and families appreciated having a dependable source of protein just a few steps from the kitchen door. Collecting eggs each morning became another small ritual connecting daily life with the food on the table. Even preserving food required physical effort. Women spent long summer days washing fruit, sterilizing jars, preparing vegetables, and standing beside hot stoves while canning the harvest. The process demanded patience, but it rewarded families with shelves full of tomatoes, peaches, beans, applesauce, pickles, and jams that would nourish them through the colder seasons. As supermarkets gradually expanded during the late 1950s, more processed foods began appearing on store shelves. Bright packaging promised convenience, speed, and modern living. Many families welcomed these innovations, grateful for anything that reduced time spent in the kitchen. Yet with every shortcut came a subtle change. Meals that once required chopping, stirring, simmering, and waiting slowly gave way to foods that could be opened, heated, and served within minutes. No one at the time imagined how dramatically eating habits would evolve over the following decades. Portion sizes would grow larger, snacks would become available almost everywhere. Sugary drinks would become everyday companions. Restaurants would serve meals large enough for 2 or even 3 people. Kitchens would gradually fill with convenience foods that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. Looking back across the quiet kitchens of the 1950s, the lesson feels remarkably simple. The foods that helped many women remain slim were not hidden in rare ingredients or secret family recipes. They were found in bowls of homemade soup, plates filled with vegetables, fresh seasonal fruit, modest portions of meat, baked potatoes, whole grains, beans, eggs, cottage cheese, homemade bread, and simple desserts enjoyed only from time to time. Just as important were the habits surrounding those foods: eating together, cooking from scratch, respecting leftovers, avoiding waste, and allowing hunger and fullness to guide each day. Perhaps the greatest secret of all was that these women rarely believed they possessed any secret at all. They simply cooked what was available, served what the family could afford, and repeated familiar routines learned from mothers and grandmothers before them. In those ordinary kitchens, surrounded by the comforting sounds of simmering pots and the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall, they quietly practiced a way of eating that history would one day look back upon with admiration. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful traditions are the ones so ordinary that they almost disappear from memory. As the decade drew toward its close, the quiet wisdom of those kitchens could still be found in the smallest everyday moments. A woman returning home from the market would first place the milk in the refrigerator, wrap fresh vegetables in a damp cloth to keep them crisp, and carefully arrange fruit in a bowl where everyone could see it. Nothing about the routine seemed extraordinary, yet every small decision made wholesome food the easiest choice. Convenience existed, but it was created through preparation rather than packaging. Many women believed that a proper meal should leave a person comfortably satisfied, not completely stuffed. If someone reached the point where loosening a belt or unbuttoning a dress felt necessary, it was quietly understood that too much had been eaten. There was no dramatic conversation about dieting. Instead, the next meal simply returned to normal portions. This gentle correction kept occasional indulgences from becoming permanent habits. Breakfast tables often remained remarkably peaceful. A newspaper rested beside a cup of coffee. Children hurried to finish cereal or toast before catching the school bus. Eggs sizzled softly in a cast. Iron skillet while oatmeal bubbled gently on the stove. These meals contained enough nourishment to begin the day without the enormous calorie counts found in many modern breakfast combinations. Another commonly forgotten food was grapefruit. During the 1950s, it appeared frequently at breakfast, often cut neatly in half and sprinkled with just a little sugar to soften its tart flavor. Long before grapefruit became associated with fashionable diet plans, families simply enjoyed it because it was refreshing, inexpensive in many regions, and readily available during the season. Tomatoes occupied a special place in the kitchen as well. During summer, thick slices were served beside nearly every dinner. A little salt and pepper were often all they required. Some families added a few drops of vinegar or a tiny drizzle of oil, allowing the natural sweetness of the ripe fruit to shine. Modern bottled dressings with long ingredient lists had little place on these simple plates. Even desserts reflected patience. Rice pudding slowly thickened on the stove, while milk, rice, cinnamon, and vanilla blended together over gentle heat. Bread pudding transformed stale bread into something warm and comforting. Baked custard relied on eggs and milk rather than heavy frostings. These desserts satisfied a sweet tooth while remaining surprisingly modest compared with many modern bakery treats. The family garden often provided more than vegetables. Rhubarb grew beside fences. Herbs lined narrow pathways, and berry bushes rewarded patient care each summer. Children sometimes helped gather the harvest, returning indoors with stained fingers and baskets filled with strawberries or blackberries. The connection between growing food and eating it remained close enough that every harvest carried a sense of accomplishment. One fascinating difference involved expectations. People generally expected to prepare food themselves. Opening a package and having dinner ready within minutes was still unusual for many households. Cooking skills were considered part of everyday adulthood, much like sewing a loose button or polishing a pair of shoes. These ordinary abilities quietly supported healthier eating because meals naturally centered on fresh ingredients. Mothers also became remarkably skilled at making vegetables appealing without overwhelming them. Carrots might be glazed lightly with a touch of butter. Green beans were cooked until tender and seasoned with onions. Cauliflower appeared beneath a simple cheese sauce used sparingly rather than excessively. Flavor mattered, but so did allowing the vegetables themselves to remain recognizable. Sunday afternoons often carried the comforting aroma of something baking in the oven. It might be an apple pie cooling on the windowsill, a loaf of bread rising beautifully, or a roast slowly filling the house with warmth. These smells became part of family memory, connecting food with comfort rather than constant consumption. There was also a quiet respect for appetite. If a child announced being hungry shortly before dinner, a mother might gently reply, "Supper will be ready soon," instead of immediately opening another snack. Families trusted that the upcoming meal would satisfy everyone. This simple habit helped preserve natural hunger, making ordinary foods taste even more enjoyable. Even celebrations demonstrated restraint by modern standards. Church picnics, neighborhood gatherings, birthdays, and holiday dinners certainly featured cakes, pies, cookies, and homemade candies. Yet these occasions felt memorable precisely because they were different from ordinary weekdays. Rich foods remained associated with celebration rather than becoming everyday expectations. Another forgotten kitchen companion was the handwritten recipe card. Small boxes filled with carefully written recipes sat tucked inside drawers or cupboards. Many cards displayed faded ink, flour stains, and notes scribbled in the margins after years of faithful use. Rather than constantly searching for new recipes, women perfected familiar dishes until they could prepare them almost without thinking. During colder evenings, a kettle often remained quietly warming on the stove. A cup of tea or warm broth provided comfort without the need for elaborate snacks. These simple drinks helped create an atmosphere of relaxation where conversation, knitting, reading, or listening to the radio replaced mindless eating. Food advertising during the era frequently emphasized family meals rather than individual snacking. The image of everyone gathered around one table remained powerful. Whether reality always matched the advertisements is another question. But the ideal itself encouraged structured meals instead of endless grazing throughout the day. Looking through surviving family photographs from the 1950s, historians often notice dining tables that appear surprisingly simple. There are no towering restaurant portions, no oversized cups filled with sugary drinks, and no endless assortment of packaged snacks. Instead, the table usually displays one main dish, a few vegetables, bread, butter, and perhaps a homemade dessert waiting quietly in the kitchen for later. The simplicity almost seems elegant. Many women also believed that eating slowly showed good manners. Taking time between bites, chewing carefully, and participating in conversation were considered signs of proper behavior. Although taught as etiquette, these habits also allowed the body's natural signals of fullness to appear before too much food had been eaten. As modern nutrition science continues to evolve, researchers often return to these historical eating patterns with renewed curiosity. While no decade should be viewed through rose-colored glasses, there is something undeniably valuable about the balance that characterized so many ordinary kitchens of the era. Real ingredients, predictable meal times, modest portions, seasonal produce, and homemade cooking formed a combination that quietly supported health without demanding constant attention. Perhaps that is the enduring charm of these unspoken 1950s foods. They never promised perfection. They never claimed to transform lives overnight. Instead, they offered something much quieter, steady nourishment, practical wisdom, and daily routines repeated with care. A bowl of oatmeal on Monday looked much like the one served the week before. A pot of vegetable soup warmed the family just as it had every winter for years. Fresh fruit appeared whenever the seasons allowed. Bread rose patiently beneath a kitchen towel. Soup simmered while children completed homework nearby. Life moved gently from one meal to the next, and maybe that is the greatest lesson these forgotten kitchens still have to teach us. Health was not hidden inside a miracle ingredient waiting to be discovered. It was built gradually through thousands of ordinary choices. Choosing an apple instead of a candy bar, serving another spoonful of green beans before reaching for dessert, drinking water with dinner, saving leftovers for tomorrow, and treating food with gratitude instead of excess. These were the quiet traditions that rarely made headlines, yet they shaped generations of women who often remained slim, not because they chased the latest trend, but because they lived within a food culture that quietly encouraged balance every single day. There was also something deeply comforting about the pace of a 1950s kitchen. Nothing demanded instant attention. A pot of soup could simmer for hours while laundry dried on the clothesline outside. Bread dough quietly doubled in size beneath a clean towel while children played in the yard. Apples slowly baked in the oven, filling the house with a gentle fragrance that drifted from room to room. The waiting itself became part of the meal. Unlike today's world, where food often arrives in minutes, preparing dinner required patience, and patience naturally slowed the rhythm of eating. Many women also believed that breakfast set the tone for the entire day. Skipping breakfast was far less common, because the morning often involved several hours of physical work, sweeping floors, making beds, washing dishes, hanging laundry, ironing clothes, shopping for groceries, and caring for children all required steady energy. A nourishing breakfast of eggs, porridge, toast, or fruit was seen as practical fuel rather than an indulgence. Lone surprisingly common lunch consisted of homemade soup, paired with half a sandwich instead of a large, overflowing meal. Tomato soup with grilled cheese, chicken soup with crackers, or vegetable soup served alongside a simple ham sandwich created satisfying combinations. Without excessive portions, warm soup encouraged slow eating, and by the time the bowl was empty, many people felt comfortably full. Seasonal traditions shaped desserts as well. During autumn, pumpkin appeared in pies, breads, and soups. Winter brought baked pears and warm rice pudding. Spring welcomed strawberries, while summer celebrated peaches, cherries, and blueberries. Because each fruit had its season, families eagerly anticipated their return, instead of expecting every ingredient to be available every month of the year. Many households also prepared simple fruit compotes by gently simmering apples, berries, or peaches, with only a little water and a touch of sugar, served warm or chilled. These soft fruits satisfied the desire for something sweet, while remaining centered on fresh produce, rather than refined ingredients. Another overlooked food was cabbage soup. Though humble, it appeared regularly because cabbage stored well, cost little, and stretched easily into filling meals. Combined with onions, carrots, celery, tomatoes, and perhaps a few pieces of beef or beans, cabbage soup became a comforting dinner during cooler months. It was nourishing, inexpensive, and surprisingly satisfying. Even table manners quietly influenced eating habits. Children were encouraged to finish chewing before taking another bite. Speaking with food in one's mouth was considered impolite, naturally slowing the pace of meals. Drinking water between bites, instead of sugary beverages, also encouraged people to pause, giving the body time to recognize fullness. Many women found satisfaction not from endless variety, but from familiar meals prepared exceptionally well. Monday's meatloaf, Tuesday's soup, Wednesday's roast chicken, Thursday's baked fish, and Friday's bean casserole created a predictable weekly rhythm. Familiarity reduced unnecessary decision making and helped families shop efficiently while avoiding waste. Fresh herbs continue to play an important role throughout the seasons. Mint-flavored iced tea during summer, parsley-brightened soups, rosemary-scented roasted potatoes, and sage-complemented poultry dishes. These herbs added fragrance and flavor without relying on heavy sauces or excessive salt. The kitchen itself encouraged movement. Flour was stored in large containers that needed lifting. Water boiled on the stove instead of being dispensed instantly. Vegetables were scrubbed, peeled, chopped, and stirred by hand. Heavy cast, iron cookware demanded strength to move from stove to table. Every meal involved dozens of small physical tasks that quietly burned energy throughout the day. Many women walked through local markets, carrying woven baskets instead of pushing oversized shopping carts, filled with weeks of convenience foods. They purchased fresh ingredients intended for the next few days, allowing meals to revolve around what was seasonal and available, rather than what could remain on a shelf indefinitely. Fresh dairy products were appreciated because they spoiled quickly. Milk, cream, and cottage cheese were purchased with the intention of using them soon, encouraging regular home cooking. There was little temptation to stockpile endless quantities of processed foods, simply because storage space remained limited. During the warmer months, iced tea became a favorite afternoon refreshment. Unlike many modern bottled versions, homemade iced tea contained only tea, water, and perhaps a modest amount of sugar with a slice of lemon. It offered refreshment without delivering enormous amounts of sweetness. Many families also enjoyed simple breakfasts of toast topped with sliced tomatoes or cottage cheese. Though these combinations may seem plain today, they reflected a practical understanding that nourishing food did not need elaborate preparation. Fresh ingredients often tasted satisfying on their own. The evening meal frequently ended with fresh fruit rather than dessert. A bowl of cherries, sliced watermelon, peaches, or grapes could conclude dinner during summer months. Sweetness came directly from nature, and because fresh fruit felt like a treat, there was little sense of missing richer desserts. As refrigerators became more common, women appreciated being able to keep fresh vegetables crisp for several days. Lettuce, celery, carrots, and cucumbers remained ready for salads, making it easier to include vegetables with nearly every lunch or dinner. Looking through old community cookbooks reveals countless recipes emphasizing vegetables, beans, soups, casseroles, and baked dishes prepared from basic pantry ingredients. While some recipes certainly featured generous amounts of butter or cream, the majority reflected practical home cooking designed to nourish families economically. One detail often forgotten today is how rarely people ate while traveling. Cars were for transportation, not dining rooms. Food was usually consumed at the kitchen table, the dining room, or perhaps during a picnic. Eating while driving, shopping, or walking down the street was uncommon, allowing meals to remain intentional events rather than constant background activities. The sounds of the kitchen also told their own story. The steady chopping of vegetables, the gentle bubbling of soup, the whistle of a kettle, the creak of cupboard doors, and the soft ticking of the wall clock created a peaceful atmosphere that encouraged mindfulness without anyone using that modern word. Meals unfolded within these familiar sounds, free from the endless digital distractions that accompany many meals today. As the stars appeared outside and another day quietly ended, tomorrow's menu was often already taking shape. Beans soaked overnight for soup. Bread dough rested beneath its cloth. Leftover vegetables waited patiently for tomorrow's casserole. A shopping list sat neatly on the counter with only a handful of simple ingredients written upon it. These small preparations made healthy eating feel effortless because much of the work had already been done. Perhaps that is why the unspoken foods of the 1950s continue to capture our imagination. They remind us that lasting habits rarely depend upon extraordinary discipline or complicated rules. Instead, they grow from ordinary routines repeated with consistency, choosing real food over convenience, preparing meals with care, respecting the seasons, eating together whenever possible, and allowing simple ingredients to shine. In those quiet kitchens, illuminated by the warm glow of a single ceiling light, and filled with the comforting aroma of homemade meals, many women unknowingly practiced a timeless approach to eating. It was never advertised as revolutionary. It simply became part of everyday life. One humble breakfast, one comforting bowl of soup, and one family dinner at a time. If you could quietly open the pantry door of an average 1950s home, you might be surprised by what you did not find. There would be no rows of brightly coloured protein bars, no oversized tubs of flavoured snacks, no shelves overflowing with sugary breakfast treats, and no endless collection of bottled sauces promising instant flavour. Instead, you would likely see sacks of flour, jars of oats, dried beans, rice, canned vegetables, homemade preserves, tea, coffee, baking supplies, and carefully labelled jars filled during the previous harvest. It was a pantry built for cooking rather than constant snacking. And that simple difference shaped nearly every meal prepared inside the home. Women also became remarkably skilled at recognizing the natural value of each ingredient. Carrot tops sometimes flavored homemade broth. Celery leaves seasoned soups instead of being thrown away. Beet greens found their way into side dishes. Apple peels occasionally became jelly or vinegar. Long before the phrase "reduce food waste" became popular, families practiced it out of necessity. Every ingredient carried value, making meals feel more thoughtful and less excessive. Many kitchens included a simple fruit bowl sitting permanently in the center of the table. Throughout the week it changed with the seasons. In spring it might hold oranges and early strawberries. Summer brought peaches, plums, cherries, and apricots. Autumn displayed apples and pears, while winter often featured citrus fruits that brightened otherwise cold days. Family members passing through the kitchen naturally reached for a piece of fruit because it was visible, ready to eat, and required no preparation. Cooking methods also played a surprisingly important role. Baking, boiling, steaming, roasting, and stewing were everyday techniques. Deep frying certainly existed, but it occupied a much smaller place in the average household than many people imagine. Roasted vegetables developed sweetness without needing heavy sauces. Stews created tenderness through time rather than added fat. Soup relied on slow simmering to build flavor naturally. Many women quietly followed another habit that seems almost forgotten today. They served meals onto plates in the kitchen before bringing them to the table. Serving bowls did not always remain within easy reach throughout dinner. This gentle practice reduced the temptation to return repeatedly for second or third helpings, simply because the food remained directly in front of everyone. Simple garnishes added beauty without adding excess. Fresh parsley brightened mashed potatoes. A slice of lemon rested beside baked fish. Paprika lightly dusted deviled eggs. A few sprigs of mint-decorated fruit presentation mattered, but elegance came through freshness and care rather than abundance. Known fascinating detail appears again and again in old household magazines from the era. Recipes frequently encouraged homemakers to stretch ingredients instead of increasing portions. Extra vegetables bulked out casseroles. Oatmeal extended meatloaf. Beans enriched soups. Rice accompanied stews. These additions were economical, but they also naturally increased fiber while reducing the amount of richer ingredients needed for each serving. The family refrigerator often reflected the rhythm of the week. Fresh groceries purchased on Monday gradually transformed into different meals over several days. Leftover roast became sandwiches. Vegetables entered soup. Extra rice became rice pudding. Nothing remained forgotten at the back of the refrigerator for weeks, because every item had a planned purpose. Women also paid close attention to the changing weather when planning meals. On warm summer evenings, lighter dinners of salads, sliced tomatoes, cold chicken, and fresh fruit felt refreshing. During snowy winters, hearty soups, baked potatoes, casseroles, and warm puddings offered comfort against the cold. The menu naturally shifted with the seasons instead of remaining identical. Throughout the year, there was another quiet difference that rarely receives attention. Meals usually ended when everyone finished eating. Sitting around the table for another hour, while absent-mindedly picking at leftovers, was uncommon. Plates were cleared, dishes washed, leftovers stored, and the kitchen prepared for tomorrow. This clear ending helped establish natural boundaries around eating. Many women also relied on smell and appearance instead of complicated nutritional information. They knew when bread had baked long enough simply by its aroma. Soup was ready when vegetables became tender. Fruit was sweetest when perfectly ripe. Cooking relied upon observation, experience, and patience, developed over years rather than strict formulas. Anna the modest favourite, was homemade baked beans, slowly cooked with onions and simple seasonings. They became a satisfying meal served with brown bread or alongside roasted vegetables, rich in fibre and filling enough to satisfy hunger for hours. Beans quietly remained one of the most practical foods in the kitchen. Fresh corn during summer rarely needed anything more than a small amount of butter and a pinch of salt. Tomatoes were sliced and served almost immediately after being picked. Cucumbers appeared with vinegar and herbs. Seasonal vegetables tasted vibrant because they often travelled only a short distance from garden to table. The pace of grocery shopping also encouraged mindfulness. Women often knew the butcher, the baker, and the produce seller personally. Conversations about the freshest vegetables or the best cut of meat became part of the shopping experience. Food was connected to people rather than anonymous shelves filled with endless options. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the absence of constant nutritional anxiety. Families certainly cared about serving wholesome meals, but they were not overwhelmed by conflicting advice, appearing every hour from newspapers, television personalities, social media, and advertising. The kitchen remained a place of routine and familiarity rather than endless confusion. By the end of each evening, after the final plate had been dried and returned to its cupboard, there was often a comforting sense of completion. Tomorrow's breakfast might already be quietly waiting, a loaf of bread cooling beneath a cloth, oatmeal measured into a saucepan, or fruit arranged neatly in a bowl. These tiny acts of preparation made healthy choices feel automatic rather than difficult. Looking back today, it becomes easier to understand why so many women maintained healthy body weights without following formal diet plans. They lived in an environment where ordinary choices naturally encouraged moderation. The pantry held simple ingredients. The refrigerator contained real food. Meals followed predictable schedules. Portions remained sensible. Desserts stayed special. Walking, cooking, gardening, cleaning, and shopping added movement throughout the day. None of these habits seemed extraordinary by themselves, but together they formed a quiet pattern that gently supported health year after year. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson hidden inside those peaceful kitchens of the 1950s. The foods themselves were humble: vegetable soup, oatmeal, cottage cheese, baked potatoes, beans, eggs, fresh fruit, homemade bread, seasonal vegetables, and modest family dinners. Yet when combined with patience, routine, gratitude, and the simple pleasure of sharing a meal around the table, these ordinary foods became part of a lifestyle so balanced that many women hardly noticed it at all. Their secret was never written in a cookbook or advertised on a magazine cover. It was simply lived, one calm, ordinary day at a time. As historians continue to study everyday life in the 1950s, one detail quietly stands out above all the others. Food was rarely expected to solve every problem. It was not entertainment, a reward after a stressful day, or something consumed simply to pass the time. Instead, meals had a clear purpose. They nourished the family, brought everyone together for a short while, and marked the steady rhythm of the day. Once the meal was finished, life simply continued with gardening, sewing, reading, working, or visiting neighbours. Food occupied an important place, but it did not dominate every waking moment. Another forgotten favourite was simple baked carrots. Rather than covering vegetables with heavy sauces, many women roasted carrots until their natural sweetness emerged. A small amount of butter, a sprinkle of parsley, and perhaps a pinch of black pepper were often enough. The result was colourful, satisfying, and surprisingly flavourful despite its simplicity. Many families also enjoyed barley, although it receives far less attention today, added to vegetable soup or beef stew, barley created hearty meals that remained filling for hours. Its chewy texture made soups feel more substantial without requiring large amounts of meat. During periods when household budgets were tight, barley quietly stretched meals while providing lasting nourishment. The family table itself reflected careful planning. Cloth napkins were folded neatly. Water glasses stood ready before dinner began. Salt and pepper shakers occupied the center of the table beside a small dish of butter. Nothing appeared excessive, yet everything felt welcoming. This atmosphere encouraged appreciation for the meal rather than rushing through it. Even leftovers were often transformed with surprising creativity. Cold boiled potatoes became crispy breakfast hash with onions. Extra vegetables disappeared into omelettes. Remaining roast beef found new life inside homemade pies or stews. Stale cake might become the base for a simple trifle served during a family gathering. Every ingredient continued its journey until it had served its purpose completely. Many women also relied on slow-cooked cereals during winter evenings. Rice pudding, tapioca pudding, and creamy wheat porridge offered gentle comfort before bedtime. These warm dishes satisfied without encouraging the endless snacking that has become common in later decades. Fresh cucumbers were another quiet staple during warmer months. Thinly sliced and dressed with vinegar, dill, and a little salt, they provided a refreshing contrast to richer dishes. Their crisp texture and cooling flavor made them especially popular during hot summer afternoons, when heavier meals felt less appealing. There was also a remarkable appreciation for simple sandwiches prepared with care. Freshly sliced tomatoes, crisp lettuce, boiled eggs, or leftover chicken became satisfying lunches because the ingredients were fresh and thoughtfully arranged. Bread was rarely overloaded with fillings. Instead, each ingredient remained balanced, allowing every bite to taste complete without becoming overwhelming. Another subtle habit involved finishing meals with conversation rather than additional food. After dinner, family members often remained seated for several minutes, discussing the day's events. Children talked about school. Fathers shared stories from work, and mothers planned tomorrow's errands. This quiet pause allowed everyone to recognize that they were comfortably satisfied before leaving the table. Many kitchens also contained handwritten shopping lists clipped to the refrigerator or tucked inside a recipe book. The lists were surprisingly ordinary: milk, eggs, potatoes, onions, carrots, flour, butter, apples, cabbage, coffee, sugar, and bread. Looking at these lists today reveals how much everyday cooking depended on simple, recognizable ingredients rather than specialized products. Seasonal celebrations offered another glimpse into the era's balanced approach to food. Christmas brought homemade cookies, fruitcake, roasted turkey, and festive pies. Easter featured baked ham and spring vegetables. Summer picnics included potato salad, fresh watermelon, and lemonade. Yet once the celebration ended, families quietly returned to their familiar weekday meals without feeling the need for dramatic diets or strict restrictions. Many women also developed impressive skills at estimating portions simply by sight. Years of preparing meals for growing families taught them exactly how much soup to ladle into each bowl, or how many potatoes to prepare for dinner. This experience helped prevent both waste and unnecessary overeating. The kitchen garden remained an important source of pride for countless households. Rows of beans climbed wooden poles while tomatoes ripened beneath the summer sun. Lettuce, spinach, onions, and herbs filled smaller spaces, rewarding careful attention throughout the growing season. Every successful harvest reinforced the connection between patience and nourishment. Simple desserts continued to reflect the seasons as well. Fresh strawberries topped homemade shortcake for only a few weeks each year. Apples filled fragrant pies during autumn. Rhubarb appeared briefly in spring before disappearing until the following year. Because these desserts depended on seasonal ingredients, they remained special instead of becoming everyday expectations. Even ordinary drinking water carried a different significance. Glasses of cold water often accompanied meals without anyone considering it unusual. Sugary beverages existed, but they remained occasional treats. Water quietly fulfilled its purpose without requiring colourful labels or clever advertising. As electric refrigerators, modern supermarkets and convenience foods gradually became more widespread, the kitchen slowly changed. New products promised to reduce preparation time and simplify household work. Many of these innovations genuinely improved daily life, giving women more freedom and flexibility. Yet they also marked the beginning of a gradual shift away from the slower food traditions that had quietly supported balanced eating for generations. Looking back across the decade, it becomes clear that no single ingredient deserves all the credit. It was never just oatmeal, apples, cabbage, cottage cheese, or vegetable soup. Instead, it was the combination of countless ordinary habits working together: cooking from scratch, eating at regular times, respecting seasonal produce, limiting waste, enjoying modest portions, sharing meals with family, choosing water, milk, tea, or coffee instead of sugary drinks, allowing desserts to remain occasional pleasures rather than daily expectations. Perhaps that is why these forgotten foods still capture our curiosity today. They remind us that good health often grows quietly, almost unnoticed, through simple routines repeated over many years. A woman standing at her kitchen counter in 1954 probably never imagined that future generations would study her grocery list with fascination. To her, preparing oatmeal before sunrise, peeling potatoes for supper, baking bread on a rainy afternoon, or serving sliced peaches after dinner were simply ordinary parts of life. Yet history often hides its greatest lessons inside ordinary moments. The secret was never a miracle ingredient waiting to be rediscovered. It lived in the steady rhythm of those peaceful kitchens, where fresh vegetables filled wooden bowls, soup simmered patiently on the stove, fruit ripened on the windowsill, and families gathered around the dinner table each evening. There, surrounded by the comforting sounds of everyday life, many women unknowingly followed a pattern of eating that encouraged balance without obsession, nourishment without excess, and satisfaction without constant indulgence. It was a quiet tradition built not on perfection, but on consistency. A tradition remembered today, not because it was fashionable, but because it worked so naturally that the people living it hardly noticed it at all. There is one final detail that is easy to overlook when thinking about the kitchens of the 1950s, yet it may explain more than any single recipe ever could. Most meals began with whatever the family already had at home, not with whatever sounded exciting in the moment. Women opened the pantry, checked the vegetable basket, looked inside the refrigerator, and built dinner from those ingredients. This simple habit encouraged creativity while preventing unnecessary shopping trips and impulse purchases. A handful of carrots, 2 onions, a few potatoes, and some leftover roast could become a hearty stew. Half a cabbage, a couple of tomatoes, and yesterday's chicken might become tomorrow's soup. Nothing needed to be extravagant to feel satisfying. The refrigerator itself often reflected careful organization. Milk occupied one shelf, butter another. Leftover vegetables were stored in covered dishes, and homemade desserts waited patiently for a special occasion later in the week. There was little room for dozens of bottled drinks or packaged snacks because space was limited. Every item had earned its place by contributing to an upcoming meal. Many women also believed that every dinner should include something green, whether it was spinach, green beans, peas, lettuce, cabbage, or broccoli. Vegetables rarely appeared as an afterthought. They formed an expected part of the meal, bringing colour as well as nourishment to the dinner table. Children might not always welcome them with enthusiasm, but they quickly learned that vegetables belonged beside the main course, just as naturally as bread or potatoes. Another humble favourite was baked tomatoes. Fresh tomatoes were cut in half, lightly seasoned, sprinkled with breadcrumbs or herbs, and baked until soft. The recipe required almost no effort, yet it transformed an ordinary vegetable into a comforting side dish. Recipes like these quietly demonstrate how simple ingredients were appreciated, instead of hidden beneath layers of rich toppings. Many homes also kept a small collection of pickled vegetables, cucumbers, onions, beets, and even green beans were preserved in vinegar with herbs and spices. These pickles added brightness to meals, while helping families enjoy vegetables long after the growing season had ended. A few slices beside a sandwich or roast dinner brought freshness without requiring elaborate preparation. During harvest season, kitchens became especially busy. Baskets overflowing with apples, peaches, tomatoes, beans, and pears covered countertops waiting to be canned or preserved. Entire afternoons disappeared into washing jars, preparing fruit, boiling water, and sealing lids. Though tiring, these days represented an investment in the months ahead. Winter meals would later carry the flavours of summer because of the work completed during those warm afternoons. Many women also prepared simple egg dishes for dinner when household budgets were stretched. Vegetable omelettes, baked eggs, or egg salads offered nourishing meals that were both economical and satisfying. Eggs proved that expensive ingredients were not necessary for a wholesome supper. Fresh herbs often came directly from the windowsill during colder months. Parsley, chives, and mint continued growing indoors, adding fresh flavour even when gardens rested beneath frost. A small handful of chopped herbs could brighten an entire pot of soup without adding unnecessary richness. Another interesting difference involved serving dishes. Large decorative bowls, filled with vegetables, often occupied the centre of the table, reminding everyone that produce deserved just as much attention as the meat. Potatoes, carrots, peas, or corn were presented with pride rather than treated merely as side dishes. Many women also understood the importance of making meals visually appealing. Bright orange carrots, deep green beans, golden corn, red tomatoes, creamy mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread created colourful tables long before anyone discussed eating the rainbow. Beauty encouraged appreciation for simple foods. The pace of dessert remained wonderfully unhurried. A pie baked that afternoon might not even be sliced until evening coffee. Fresh fruit sometimes rested on the counter until everyone naturally felt ready for something sweet. There was no expectation that every craving required immediate satisfaction. Neighbourhood gardens also encouraged sharing. If one family harvested more tomatoes than they could use, baskets often appeared on a neighbour's doorstep. Someone else might return the kindness later with fresh cucumbers, peaches, or homemade jam. This quiet exchange brought greater variety to family meals. while strengthening community ties. Children often helped with simple kitchen tasks from an early age, washing vegetables, peeling peas, shelling beans, stirring batter, or setting the table became ordinary responsibilities. These experiences quietly taught cooking skills that many carried into adulthood, making home prepared meals feel familiar rather than intimidating. Even the weather influenced the menu in thoughtful ways. Rainy evenings invited hearty soups and homemade bread. Hot afternoons encouraged crisp salads and chilled fruit. Cold winter mornings called for steaming bowls of oatmeal or cream of wheat. The seasons shaped the kitchen naturally, creating variety without requiring endless new recipes. As food technology advanced during the following decades, many traditional habits slowly faded. Supermarkets expanded dramatically. Restaurants offered increasingly larger portions. Convenience foods became household staples, and advertising encouraged frequent snacking throughout the day. None of these changes happened overnight. They arrived gradually, almost unnoticed, transforming the relationship between families and food, one generation at a time. Yet despite all those changes, the quiet lessons from a typical 1950s kitchen still remain remarkably relevant. Fresh ingredients usually taste best with simple preparation. Seasonal foods often bring the greatest flavor. Home cooking allows people to understand exactly what goes into each meal. Sharing dinner around a table creates memories that no packaged product can replace. Moderation often succeeds where extremes fail. Perhaps that is why these forgotten foods continue to inspire such curiosity. They remind us of a time when health was woven gently into everyday life, instead of separated into complicated plans and strict routines. A woman slicing apples for tomorrow's pie, stirring vegetable soup before sunset, baking potatoes beside a roast, or arranging fresh lettuce on a serving plate, probably never imagined she was creating a historical snapshot of balanced eating. In the end, the unspoken foods that helped many women remain slim were never hidden inside secret cookbooks or exclusive recipes. They were quietly waiting in ordinary kitchens, in bowls of oatmeal warming the breakfast table, in fresh apples resting beside the window, in cabbage simmering gently with onions, in homemade bread cooling on a wire rack, in simple bean soups shared during winter evenings, and in family dinners where conversation mattered just as much as the meal itself. Their true strength was never found in perfection or strict rules, but in countless ordinary habits repeated day after day. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all. History's quietest kitchens remind us that sometimes the most enduring wisdom is also the simplest, carried not in dramatic discoveries, but in the humble meals that nourished generations with patience, care, and quiet consistency. As we gently step away from the kitchens of the 1950s, there is one more quiet observation worth making. The women of that era rarely described food using words like superfood, clean eating, low carb, or high protein. Those expressions belong to another time. Instead, they spoke about meals being hearty, wholesome, filling, or nourishing. A good dinner was one that satisfied the family, stayed within the household budget, and left enough leftovers for tomorrow's lunch. The language surrounding food was remarkably practical, reflecting a generation that valued usefulness over fashionable trends. Morning shopping trips often began at small neighborhood stores where produce was displayed in wooden crates rather than endless refrigerated aisles. Women picked up firm heads of lettuce, bunches of carrots still carrying traces of garden soil, crisp celery, onions, potatoes, and whatever fruit happened to be at its peak. Since many fruits and vegetables travelled shorter distances than they do today, freshness often depended on the local growing season rather than global transportation networks. Zone forgotten habit involved preparing vegetables immediately after returning home. Lettuce was washed and wrapped carefully. Celery was trimmed and placed in cold water to remain crisp. Carrots were cleaned and stored for easy use throughout the week. This simple preparation made wholesome foods convenient, long before anyone began using the phrase meal prep. Many women also kept homemade broth, frozen or stored in glass jars. Whenever soup was needed, the broth provided a flavorful foundation without relying on packaged mixes. Into that broth went carrots, onions, beans, barley, potatoes, cabbage, leftover chicken, or whatever ingredients needed to be used before they spoiled. Every pot became slightly different, reflecting the changing contents of the pantry and refrigerator. Simple breakfasts frequently included stewed prunes, pears, or apples during colder months. These warm fruits were comforting, naturally sweet, and easy to digest. They appeared so regularly that few families considered them unusual. Today they might seem old-fashioned, but at the time they represented ordinary nourishment. There was also an appreciation for eating food while it was truly in season. The first strawberries of spring were eagerly anticipated, because everyone understood they would disappear within a few weeks. Sweet corn tasted special because it belonged to summer alone. Apples became symbols of autumn, while citrus fruits brightened the winter months. Seasonal eating created excitement, without requiring constant novelty. Many kitchens contained handwritten calendars reminding the family when vegetables should be planted, harvested, preserved, or purchased. Food remained closely connected to nature's timetable rather than existing independently of it. This connection quietly encouraged variety throughout the year. Even something as ordinary as peeling potatoes reflected patience. Women often stood beside the sink preparing vegetables one by one, knowing that the finished meal depended upon careful attention to each ingredient. There were no shortcuts promising instant results. Good food arrived gradually, rewarding time invested in its preparation. Family recipes also changed very little from year to year. A favourite soup prepared in 1952 likely tasted almost identical in 1958. Because recipes were treasured and repeated. Familiarity created comfort, while consistency helped families maintain balanced eating habits almost effortlessly. Another humble ingredient that appeared surprisingly often was onions. They flavoured soups, stews, casseroles, meatloaf, gravies, salads, and roasted vegetables. Inexpensive, versatile, and available throughout the year, onions quietly became one of the foundations of home cooking. Fresh herbs were often chopped only moments before serving. Parsley scattered across boiled potatoes, dill folded into cucumber salad, and chives sprinkled over scrambled eggs added freshness without overwhelming the meal. Flavour came from the ingredients themselves rather than from highly processed seasonings. Many women also believed that wasting food showed poor character. Children were encouraged to appreciate what appeared on their plates because someone had worked hard to earn the money, grow the vegetables, prepare the meal, and set the table. Gratitude became part of dining, even if it was rarely discussed in those exact words. As evening approached, the kitchen slowly became quieter. The day's final loaf of bread, cooled on the counter leftover soup, rested in the refrigerator. Tomorrow's lunch ingredients were already waiting. The radio played softly in the background, while dishes dried beside the sink. These peaceful routines repeated themselves countless times throughout the decade, creating a rhythm that felt comforting precisely because it changed so little. Looking back now, perhaps the greatest surprise is how ordinary everything appears. There are no mysterious ingredients hidden inside forgotten cupboards, no secret spices imported from distant lands, no elaborate formulas passed down through generations. Instead, there are bowls of oatmeal, fresh vegetables, homemade soups, seasonal fruit, beans, potatoes, eggs, cottage cheese, simple salads, roasted meat served in modest portions, homemade bread, and desserts reserved for moments worth celebrating. The women who prepared these meals likely never imagined that decades later, people would search for the secret behind their healthy appearance. If asked how they stayed slim, many might have simply shrugged and described yesterday's dinner or tomorrow's grocery list. To them, there was nothing extraordinary about peeling carrots, simmering soup, baking bread, or serving apples after supper. It was simply life as they knew it. And perhaps that quiet simplicity is the real story. The unspoken foods of the 1950s did not promise instant transformation because they were never designed to. They represented a slower relationship with eating, one built on patience instead of speed, routine instead of novelty, moderation instead of excess, and gratitude instead of constant consumption. Each meal reflected ordinary choices made with consistency rather than perfection. As the lights in those cozy kitchens gradually dimmed and another peaceful day came to a close, tomorrow's meals were already beginning to take shape. A pot waited on the stove for morning oatmeal. Bread dough rested beneath a clean towel. Fresh vegetables sat neatly arranged inside the pantry. Apples filled a wooden bowl on the table, quietly catching the last rays of evening sunlight through the kitchen window. There, in the calm rhythm of everyday life, the real secret had been waiting all along, not inside one remarkable food, but within a lifetime of simple habits repeated with care. One breakfast, one lunch, and one family dinner at a time. Even beyond the food itself, the atmosphere surrounding meals in the 1950s deserves a closer look. Imagine a quiet weekday evening as the sun begins to dip below the rooftops. The kitchen windows are slightly open, allowing a cool breeze to drift through lace curtains. A radio softly plays popular tunes in the background, while a pot gently bubbles on the stove. The aroma of onions, carrots, celery, and herbs slowly fills every room in the house. There is no rush to finish cooking in 5 minutes, no delivery driver approaching the front door, and no endless scrolling through menus, wondering what to eat. Dinner has been planned since the morning, and everyone knows roughly what will be served. Many women developed an incredible ability to judge freshness simply by touch. They gently squeezed peaches to check their ripeness, listened for the crisp snap of fresh green beans, smelled ripe tomatoes before placing them into shopping baskets, and chose apples with firm skins that would remain fresh for days. Shopping itself required attention and experience, strengthening the connection between the cook and the ingredients long before they reached the dinner table. A forgotten favourite during colder months was split pea soup. Simmered with onions, carrots, celery, and perhaps a small piece of ham for flavour, it became a filling meal that could feed an entire family. Thick, warm, and comforting, it demonstrated how dried legumes could provide remarkable nourishment at very little cost. Served with a slice of homemade bread, it was considered a complete supper in many households. Another common sight was a bowl of fresh radishes resting beside the dinner plate. Their crisp texture and peppery flavor added freshness without requiring elaborate preparation. Along with celery sticks, sliced cucumbers and carrot sticks, raw vegetables often appeared before the main course, quietly satisfying hunger before richer foods were served. Many women also made their own salad dressings. A little vinegar, a splash of oil, a pinch of salt, black pepper, and perhaps a touch of mustard were whisked together in seconds. These homemade dressings tasted bright and fresh without containing the long lists of preservatives, sugars, and additives that later became common in bottled versions. The kitchen table itself often reflected years of family life. Small scratches marked where children had completed homework. Tiny dents revealed decades of shared meals. Every evening, the same table welcomed another dinner, another conversation, another ordinary moment that would quietly become part of family history. During summer, fresh melon frequently appeared after dinner. Watermelon, cantaloupe, or honeydew required nothing more than slicing before serving. Their natural sweetness brought a refreshing close to warm evenings, without the need for rich desserts. Many homemakers also kept handwritten notebooks, recording successful recipes, preserving techniques, and seasonal reminders. Over the years, these notebooks became treasured family possessions, filled with practical knowledge gathered through experience rather than fashionable advice. A soup recipe might include a small handwritten note saying, "Add more parsley in winter," or "Use fresh tomatoes when available." These tiny observations reflected decades of quiet learning. Even baking followed nature's rhythm. Bread was often prepared on cooler mornings before the afternoon heat arrived. Pies cooled slowly on windowsills where gentle breezes carried away the warmth. Cakes were baked for birthdays, church gatherings, or Sunday afternoons rather than appearing as everyday expectations. The weekly roast also tells an interesting story. Whether it was beef, pork, or chicken, one carefully prepared roast frequently supplied several meals. Sunday's elegant dinner became Monday's sandwiches, Tuesday's soup, and perhaps Wednesday's casserole. Stretching ingredients was considered a sign of good household management, not a sacrifice. Fresh herbs continue to quietly transform simple foods. Dill brightened boiled potatoes, thyme-flavored stews, rosemary-scented roasted vegetables, and mint-refreshed fruit salads. These herbs provided wonderful flavor while allowing meals to remain light and uncomplicated. There was another habit that rarely receives attention today. Many families simply accepted that they would feel slightly hungry before meals. Hunger was not something to eliminate every hour with snacks. Instead, it was a pleasant reminder that breakfast, lunch, or supper was approaching. By the time everyone gathered around the table, ordinary foods tasted deeply satisfying, because genuine appetite had already developed. Many women also believed in preparing enough food, but not too much. Running out completely might feel embarrassing, yet having enormous amounts left over after every meal suggested poor planning. Learning exactly how much to cook became a valuable household skill developed over many years. Community also influenced eating habits. Church suppers, neighborhood picnics, harvest festivals, and family reunions centered on homemade dishes prepared with familiar ingredients. These gatherings celebrated abundance, without turning indulgence into an everyday lifestyle. Rich foods belonged to special moments shared with others. As more convenience products slowly entered grocery stores during the late 1950s, advertisements proudly promised to save time and modernize the kitchen. Busy homemakers understandably welcomed many of these innovations. Yet some older cooks quietly continued preparing soup from scratch, baking their own bread, and preserving vegetables just as they always had. For them, these routines were not burdens, but comforting traditions connecting one generation to the next. Looking back from today, the remarkable thing is not that these women followed strict rules. It is that their daily environment naturally encouraged balance. Real food filled the pantry. Meals happened at predictable times. Physical activity accompanied household work. Desserts remained occasional pleasures. Fresh produce changed with the seasons. Family recipes valued nourishment more than excess. Perhaps that explains why historians continue returning to these peaceful kitchens. They offer a gentle reminder that healthy eating does not always require dramatic change. Sometimes it begins with ordinary ingredients, thoughtfully prepared, shared around a familiar table, and enjoyed without hurry. As night settled over quiet neighborhoods, and the final kitchen light was switched off, tomorrow's rhythm was already waiting. Fresh milk rested in the refrigerator. Potatoes waited patiently in the pantry. Apples filled the fruit bowl. Oats remained ready for breakfast. A loaf of homemade bread sat beneath a clean cloth, cooling completely before morning arrived. Nothing about these simple scenes appeared extraordinary to the families living them. Yet together they formed a way of life that quietly nourished millions of women through one of the most memorable decades of the 20th century. A lifestyle built not upon secret foods or miracle diets, but upon patience, moderation, real ingredients, and the comforting certainty that tomorrow's meal would be prepared with the same quiet care as today's. If we were to spend one entire week inside an ordinary 1950s household, we would likely notice something that rarely appears in history books. Very little excitement surrounded food, and that was precisely the point. Meals were dependable. Monday might bring meatloaf with mashed potatoes and peas. Tuesday could feature vegetable soup with homemade bread. Wednesday might include baked fish with carrots and boiled potatoes. Thursday often meant leftovers transformed into an entirely new dish, while Friday perhaps offered bean soup or a simple casserole. Saturday introduced another family favourite, and Sunday concluded with a traditional roast that would provide meals for the beginning of the following week. This quiet rhythm removed much of the guesswork from cooking, while encouraging a naturally balanced variety of foods. One particularly overlooked ingredient was celery. Today it often appears only as part of a vegetable tray, but during the 1950s it quietly found its way into soups, stews, salads, stuffing, casseroles, and even sandwiches. Crisp celery added freshness and texture without adding unnecessary richness. Its mild flavour blended beautifully with carrots and onions, forming the familiar foundation of countless homemade recipes. Many women also made careful use of lemons. A squeeze of lemon brightened fish, fresh vegetables, salads, and even plain drinking water. Rather than relying on bottled flavourings, fresh citrus provided a simple way to make ordinary meals feel more vibrant. Kitchen cupboards usually contained only a handful of spices compared with modern collections. Black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, paprika, mustard powder, and perhaps a few dried herbs often supplied all the seasoning a family needed. Instead of overwhelming food with strong flavours, these spices gently enhanced the ingredients already on the plate. Another quiet tradition involved making lunch from whatever remained after dinner. A slice of cold roast beef, leftover potatoes, fresh lettuce, and a tomato could become a satisfying midday meal. There was little pressure to create something entirely different every time someone became hungry. Leftovers represented efficiency rather than boredom. Even cheese was treated with remarkable restraint. A few thin slices melted over vegetables or tucked inside a sandwich were enough to provide flavor. Cheese rarely overwhelmed an entire dish because it was valued for its taste rather than its quantity. Many kitchens also welcomed visitors throughout the day. A neighbor might stop by for a brief conversation over tea, bringing homemade cookies or fresh vegetables from the garden. These visits reflected communities where relationships mattered just as much as recipes. Food became a way of sharing kindness rather than displaying abundance. Another forgotten favorite was creamed spinach. Prepared with a modest amount of milk and butter instead of heavy cream, it transformed leafy greens into a comforting side dish that accompanied roast dinners throughout the decade. Similar recipes encouraged families to enjoy vegetables in ways that felt satisfying without becoming overly rich. Fresh pears often appeared in fruit bowls during autumn. Their natural sweetness made them an easy dessert after dinner or a convenient afternoon snack. Like apples, pears required almost no preparation, making them one of the simplest wholesome foods available. Women also paid close attention to keeping the pantry organized. Flour stayed in tightly sealed containers. Sugar remained dry inside glass jars. Potatoes rested in cool, dark cupboards. Onions hung inside mesh bags to encourage airflow. These careful storage methods extended the life of ingredients, reducing waste while ensuring that healthy foods were always available. There was also a remarkable appreciation for homemade jams and preserves, spread lightly over fresh bread or stirred into plain yogurt. They offered sweetness that reflected the fruit itself, rather than artificial flavorings. Because each jar represented hours of careful work during harvest season, families used them thoughtfully instead of carelessly. The evening cleanup formed another important part of the daily rhythm. Counters were wiped, dishes washed, leftovers stored, and tomorrow's breakfast quietly prepared. Walking into the kitchen the following morning meant beginning the day with an orderly space ready for another cycle of home cooking. These small routines made healthy habits easier to maintain because everything already had its proper place. Many women also believed that children should learn where food came from, whether through tending a small garden, visiting local markets, helping shell peas, or watching bread rise on the kitchen counter. Young family members grew up understanding that meals required time and effort. This awareness often encouraged greater appreciation for the food placed before them. Even simple pleasures carried a slower pace. A peach was eaten while sitting on the porch during a warm summer evening. Apples were sliced and shared while listening to the radio. Fresh berries disappeared one handful at a time after returning from the garden. There was little desire to rush through these moments because they naturally belonged to the rhythm of the day. As modern life became increasingly busy during the decades that followed, many of these quiet customs slowly disappeared. Frozen dinners replaced homemade stews. Sweetened drinks became everyday companions. Snacks became available almost everywhere. From gas stations to office desks, restaurant portions steadily grew larger, while family dinners became less predictable. None of these changes occurred overnight, yet together they gradually transformed the everyday experience of eating. When we look back now, it becomes clear that the women of the 1950s were not following a carefully designed nutrition program. They were simply living within a culture that encouraged moderation, almost without trying. Their kitchens favored fresh ingredients over heavily processed ones. Their recipes relied upon vegetables, beans, grains, fruit, eggs, dairy, and modest portions of meat. Their routines respected regular meal times, minimized waste, and celebrated home cooking as an ordinary part of daily life. Perhaps that is the quiet beauty hidden inside these forgotten foods. They remind us that some of history's most effective habits were never advertised, never branded, and never sold as revolutionary discoveries. They existed quietly in kitchens, filled with the scent of baking bread, simmering soup, and fresh apples cooling on the windowsill. They were passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, recipe card to recipe card, until they became woven into everyday life itself. And so, as we gently leave this peaceful decade behind, the image that remains is not one of strict diets or impossible beauty standards. Instead, it is the comforting picture of an ordinary kitchen at sunset. A loaf of bread rests beneath a linen towel. A pot of vegetable soup cools slowly on the stove. Fresh carrots and potatoes wait in a woven basket near the pantry door. A bowl of apples catches the fading golden light from the window, while the last dishes dry quietly beside the sink. It is a simple scene almost too ordinary to notice. Yet within these quiet moments lived a timeless lesson. That health often grows not from extraordinary foods, but from ordinary meals prepared with patience, shared with gratitude, and repeated with quiet consistency through the gentle rhythm of everyday life. If we were to spend one entire week inside an ordinary 1950s household, we would likely notice something that rarely appears in history books. Very little excitement surrounded food, and that was precisely the point. Meals were dependable. Monday might bring meatloaf with mashed potatoes and peas. Tuesday could feature vegetable soup with homemade bread. Wednesday might include baked fish with carrots and boiled potatoes. Thursday often meant leftovers transformed into an entirely new dish, while Friday perhaps offered bean soup or a simple casserole. Saturday introduced another family favourite, and Sunday concluded with a traditional roast that would provide meals for the beginning of the following week. This quiet rhythm removed much of the guesswork from cooking, while encouraging a naturally balanced variety of foods. One particularly overlooked ingredient was celery. Today it often appears only as part of a vegetable tray, but during the 1950s it quietly found its way into soups, stews, salads, stuffing, casseroles, and even sandwiches. Crisp celery added freshness and texture without adding unnecessary richness. Its mild flavour blended beautifully with carrots and onions, forming the familiar foundation of countless homemade recipes. Many women also made careful use of lemons. A squeeze of lemon brightened fish, fresh vegetables, salads, and even plain drinking water. Rather than relying on bottled flavourings, fresh citrus provided a simple way to make ordinary meals feel more vibrant. Kitchen cupboards usually contained only a handful of spices compared with modern collections. Black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, paprika, mustard powder, and perhaps a few dried herbs often supplied all the seasoning a family needed. Instead of overwhelming food with strong flavours, these spices gently enhanced the ingredients already on the plate. Another quiet tradition involved making lunch from whatever remained after dinner. A slice of cold roast beef, leftover potatoes, fresh lettuce, and a tomato could become a satisfying midday meal. There was little pressure to create something entirely different every time someone became hungry. Leftovers represented efficiency rather than boredom. Even cheese was treated with remarkable restraint. A few thin slices melted over vegetables or tucked inside a sandwich were enough to provide flavour. Cheese rarely overwhelmed an entire dish because it was valued for its taste rather than its quantity. Many kitchens also welcomed visitors throughout the day. A neighbour might stop by for a brief conversation over tea, bringing homemade cookies or fresh vegetables from the garden. These visits reflected communities where relationships mattered just as much as recipes. Food became a way of sharing kindness rather than displaying abundance. Another forgotten favourite was creamed spinach. Prepared with a modest amount of milk and butter instead of heavy cream, it transformed leafy greens into a comforting side dish that accompanied roast dinners throughout the decade. Similar recipes encouraged families to enjoy vegetables in ways that felt satisfying without becoming overly rich. Fresh pears often appeared in fruit bowls during autumn. Their natural sweetness made them an easy dessert after dinner or a convenient afternoon snack. Like apples, pears required almost no preparation, making them one of the simplest wholesome foods available. Women also paid close attention to keeping the pantry organized. Flour stayed in tightly sealed containers. Sugar remained dry inside glass jars. Potatoes rested in cool, dark cupboards. Onions hung inside mesh bags to encourage airflow. These careful storage methods extended the life of ingredients, reducing waste while ensuring that healthy foods were always available. There was also a remarkable appreciation for homemade jams and preserves, spread lightly over fresh bread or stirred into plain yogurt. They offered sweetness that reflected the fruit itself, rather than artificial flavorings. Because each jar represented hours of careful work during harvest season, families used them thoughtfully instead of carelessly. The evening cleanup formed another important part of the daily rhythm. Counters were wiped, dishes washed, leftovers stored, and tomorrow's breakfast quietly prepared. Walking into the kitchen the following morning meant beginning the day with an orderly space ready for another cycle of home cooking. These small routines made healthy habits easier to maintain because everything already had its proper place. Many women also believed that children should learn where food came from, whether through tending a small garden, visiting local markets, helping shell peas, or watching bread rise on the kitchen counter. Young family members grew up understanding that meals required time and effort. This awareness often encouraged greater appreciation for the food placed before them. Even simple pleasures carried a slower pace. A peach was eaten while sitting on the porch during a warm summer evening. Apples were sliced and shared while listening to the radio. Fresh berries disappeared one handful at a time after returning from the garden. There was little desire to rush through these moments because they naturally belonged to the rhythm of the day. As modern life became increasingly busy during the decades that followed, many of these quiet customs slowly disappeared. Frozen dinners replaced homemade stews. Sweetened drinks became everyday companions. Snacks became available almost everywhere. From gas stations to office desks, restaurant portions steadily grew larger, while family dinners became less predictable. None of these changes occurred overnight, yet together they gradually transformed the everyday experience of eating. When we look back now, it becomes clear that the women of the 1950s were not following a carefully designed nutrition program. They were simply living within a culture that encouraged moderation, almost without trying. Their kitchens favoured fresh ingredients over heavily processed ones. Their recipes relied upon vegetables, beans, grains, fruit, eggs, dairy, and modest portions of meat. Their routines respected regular meal times, minimized waste, and celebrated home cooking as an ordinary part of daily life. Perhaps that is the quiet beauty hidden inside these forgotten foods. They remind us that some of history's most effective habits were never advertised, never branded, and never sold as revolutionary discoveries. They existed quietly in kitchens, filled with the scent of baking bread, simmering soup, and fresh apples cooling on the windowsill. They were passed from mother to daughter, neighbour to neighbour, recipe card to recipe card, until they became woven into everyday life itself. And so, As we gently leave this peaceful decade behind, the image that remains is not one of strict diets or impossible beauty standards. Instead, it is the comforting picture of an ordinary kitchen at sunset. A loaf of bread rests beneath a linen towel. A pot of vegetable soup cools slowly on the stove. Fresh carrots and potatoes wait in a woven basket near the pantry door. A bowl of apples catches the fading golden light from the window, while the last dishes dry quietly beside the sink. It is a simple scene almost too ordinary to notice. Yet within these quiet moments lived a timeless lesson. That health often grows not from extraordinary foods, but from ordinary meals prepared with patience, shared with gratitude, and repeated with quiet consistency through the gentle rhythm of everyday life. As our journey through these quiet kitchens continues, it becomes clear that the greatest luxury of the 1950s was not an expensive ingredient or an elaborate recipe. It was time to peel vegetables carefully instead of opening a package, time to knead bread until the dough felt smooth beneath experienced hands, time to stir soup as it slowly developed flavour over the course of an afternoon, time to sit together at the table without glancing at a clock every few minutes. In many ways, time itself became one of the invisible ingredients that shaped healthier eating. Early each morning, sunlight often slipped through kitchen windows before the rest of the house had fully awakened. The coffee pot quietly bubbled on the stove while breakfast slowly came together. Toast browned gently beneath the broiler, eggs cooked in a well-seasoned skillet, and oatmeal thickened as it simmered. Outside, newspaper delivery bicycles rattled along quiet streets, and milk bottles waited on front porches in many neighbourhoods. The day began with simple routines that had changed very little from one week to the next. Many women also preferred buying ingredients that required preparation, because they believed fresh food simply tasted better. A head of lettuce needed washing, but it remained crisp and flavourful. Whole carrots required peeling, yet they were naturally sweet. Potatoes demanded scrubbing before baking, but their fluffy texture rewarded the extra effort. Convenience often took second place to quality, even if that meant spending more time in the kitchen. Another humble favourite was homemade apples and cheese served together. Thin slices of sharp cheddar accompanied fresh apple wedges, creating a satisfying combination of sweetness and richness that required almost no preparation. It was a reminder that enjoyable food did not always need to be complicated. The changing seasons also brought different aromas into the home. Spring smelled of fresh herbs and early vegetables. Summer carried the fragrance of ripe tomatoes, peaches, and corn. Autumn filled kitchens with cinnamon apples, pumpkins, and roasting vegetables. Winter welcomed hearty stews, warm bread, and bubbling casseroles. Every season announced itself through the foods being prepared, creating anticipation that modern year-round availability has made less noticeable. Many women quietly believed that food should nourish without drawing constant attention to itself. A meal was meant to support the day's work, not become the day's main event. Once breakfast ended, attention shifted toward household responsibilities. After lunch, there were errands to complete or children to care for. Dinner brought everyone together before the evening slowly settled into peaceful routines. Fresh cabbage often remained in the pantry for surprisingly long periods because it stored so well. It appeared shredded into salads, simmered inside soups, braised alongside onions, or stuffed with seasoned rice and meat. Few vegetables proved as practical, economical, or versatile. Simple baked pears became another comforting dessert during cooler months. Halved pears sprinkled lightly with cinnamon and baked until tender filled the kitchen with a gentle sweetness that felt comforting without becoming overwhelming. Sometimes they were served with a spoonful of plain cream, but often they were enjoyed exactly as they came from the oven. Another detail that stands out is how little attention people paid to eating while distracted. Meals happened around tables rather than televisions. Children were expected to remain seated. Adults exchanged stories from the day's events. Even quiet dinners carried a sense of presence that naturally slowed the pace of eating. Many kitchens also displayed handwritten reminders tucked beneath magnets or pinned to bulletin boards. Pick beans on Thursday. Boy flour. Can peaches this weekend. These simple notes reflected households organized around fresh ingredients and seasonal routines rather than spontaneous convenience. The local butcher often knew customers by name and suggested cuts of meat appropriate for different recipes. Bakers recommended loaves still warm from the oven. Produce sellers advised which apples were sweetest that week. Shopping involved conversation and trust, creating a stronger connection between families and the people providing their food. Even when desserts appeared, they were often shared thoughtfully. One pie might serve an entire extended family gathered after Sunday dinner. Cakes were sliced carefully to ensure everyone received a portion. Rich foods brought pleasure precisely because they remained occasional rather than constant. Many women also believed that preparing attractive meals demonstrated care for their families. Fresh parsley garnished potatoes, colourful vegetables, brightened serving dishes, and neatly folded napkins welcomed everyone to the table. Beauty came through thoughtful presentation rather than extravagant ingredients. The sound of a screen door closing behind children running in from the yard often signaled that supper was nearly ready. Hands were washed, chairs pulled toward the table, and conversations began before the first bite had even been taken. These familiar rituals repeated themselves thousands of times across neighborhoods, quietly shaping generations of eating habits. As nutrition science continues exploring the connections between food, health, and lifestyle, these peaceful kitchens remind us that many valuable habits require no complicated explanation. Eating real food, respecting hunger, enjoying vegetables every day, preparing meals at home, limiting waste, and sharing dinner with loved ones remain timeless ideas, even as the world around them continues to change. Perhaps that is why the image of the 1950s kitchen still feels so comforting. It represents a slower relationship with food, where every loaf of bread, every bowl of soup, every basket of apples, and every carefully prepared dinner reflected patience rather than urgency. Nothing about these meals was designed to become a trend. They simply reflected ordinary families doing their best with the ingredients available to them. As evening finally settles over our journey through this forgotten decade, one last scene quietly remains. The stove has been turned off, the dishes have been dried and placed neatly inside the cupboard. Tomorrow's oats have already been measured into a saucepan, and a handwritten shopping list rests beside the fruit bowl on the kitchen table. Outside, the neighborhood grows still as porch lights begin to glow beneath the evening sky. Inside, the kitchen is peaceful once again, carrying only the lingering aroma of fresh bread and vegetable soup. It is in moments like these that the quiet secret of the 1950s becomes easiest to understand. Health was never hidden inside one miraculous food. It lived gently within countless ordinary days, where simple ingredients, patient hands, modest portions, and familiar family routines came together to create a way of eating so natural that few people ever stopped to think about it. And perhaps that quiet simplicity is exactly why it continues to fascinate us all these decades later. As the memories of those quiet kitchens begin to fade into history, one final picture deserves to be preserved. Imagine opening a cookbook from the mid-1950s that has been used almost every day for years. Its pages are slightly yellowed. A few corners are folded, where favourite recipes were visited again and again. Tiny specks of flour cling to the paper, and handwritten notes fill the margins in careful pencil. Add less salt. Use fresh peaches when they are ripe. Children like this with carrots. These books were not collectibles sitting untouched on a shelf. They were working companions, opened so often that they quietly recorded the rhythm of an entire household. Every season seemed to teach its own lessons. Spring encouraged lighter meals after the long winter, filling tables with leafy greens, radishes, and fresh herbs. Summer rewarded patience with juicy tomatoes, sweet corn, green beans, cucumbers, peaches, cherries, and berries. Gathered under warm sunshine, autumn transformed kitchens into places of preservation, where apples were peeled by the basketful, pumpkins were baked until tender, and pears were carefully stored for colder days ahead. Winter invited heavier soups, casseroles, baked potatoes, and slow cook stews that warmed both the home and everyone inside it. One forgotten pleasure was simply smelling dinner long before it appeared on the table. A stew simmering for hours gradually filled every room with comforting aromas. Fresh bread announced itself before anyone entered the kitchen. Apple pies baking in the oven carried hints of cinnamon throughout the house. These gentle scents reminded everyone that a homemade meal was waiting, reducing the temptation to search elsewhere for something to eat. Many women also trusted their senses more than written instructions. They listened to the bubbling of soup, watched the colour of vegetables change as they cooked, felt bread dough become smooth beneath their fingertips, and judged doneness by aroma, rather than timers alone. Years of daily cooking developed an intuition that could not easily be measured, but quietly improved every meal. Fresh green beans often appeared on dinner tables throughout the growing season, snapped by hand during quiet afternoons. They were gently cooked until tender and served with only a little butter or herbs. The simple preparation allowed their natural sweetness to remain the star of the meal. The family fruit bowl changed almost like a calendar. Bright oranges hinted at winter. Strawberries announced spring. Peaches and plums celebrated summer. Apples and pears welcomed autumn. Long before anyone spoke about eating seasonally, families simply followed nature's schedule because that was what local markets offered. Another common sight was a cooling rack holding freshly baked muffins or biscuits. They were enjoyed while still warm, sometimes with a little butter or homemade jam, and whatever remained often became tomorrow's breakfast. Very little lingered for weeks because homemade baked goods simply did not last that long without preservatives. Women also became experts at recognizing the difference between genuine hunger and simple habit. Since snacks were less available, people naturally waited for mealtime, unless they were truly hungry. By the time dinner arrived, even modest portions tasted deeply satisfying because appetite had developed naturally throughout the day. Community gardens, church harvest festivals, and neighborhood produce stands strengthened the connection between people and their food. Families knew which neighbor grew the sweetest tomatoes, whose apple tree produced the crispest fruit, and where to find the freshest sweet corn each summer. These local relationships made food feel personal rather than anonymous. Even preserving food became a family tradition. Children helped wash peaches before canning. Grandparents shared advice about making jams or pickles. Shelves slowly filled with rows of carefully labeled jars glowing like colorful jewels beneath pantry lights. Each jar represented hours of work and the promise of future meals during the colder months. Simple breakfasts continued to anchor each new day. A boiled egg toast, oatmeal, sliced fruit, or plain yogurt might appear without much variation from week to week. Familiarity was welcomed because dependable meals simplified busy mornings and left more time for the work waiting ahead. One fascinating difference between then and now is the absence of endless food choices. Restaurants were fewer, grocery stores stocked far fewer varieties of each product. Families often prepared the same trusted recipes for years. While this may sound limiting today, it also reduced decision fatigue and encouraged confidence in simple, reliable meals. Many women quietly understood another truth that modern research continues to support. Eating together changed the experience of food. Conversation slowed every meal. Laughter stretched dinner a little longer. Children learned manners, patience, and gratitude simply by sitting around the same table each evening. Food nourished relationships just as surely as it nourished the body. Looking back across the entire decade, perhaps the greatest surprise is that nothing appeared especially remarkable at the time. A bowl of vegetable soup was simply lunch. An apple after supper was simply dessert. Homemade bread was simply bread. Yet together, these ordinary choices created a pattern that gently encouraged moderation, balance, and satisfaction, without demanding constant attention. Outside, porch lights cast warm circles onto peaceful sidewalks. Inside, the last dishes have been returned to their cupboards. Tomorrow's shopping list has been written in neat handwriting, and the kitchen rests after another ordinary day. A loaf of bread cools beneath a clean towel. A basket of fresh apples waits patiently on the table. And somewhere a pot of soup has been carefully stored for tomorrow's lunch. The women who moved through these kitchens probably never imagined that decades later people around the world would wonder how they managed to stay so naturally slim. If they could answer today, their response might be surprisingly simple. They would likely point toward the pantry filled with oats, beans, rice, potatoes, onions, and flour. They would gesture toward the garden where tomatoes ripened beneath the summer sun. They would smile at the bowl of fruit resting quietly on the table, the soup simmering gently on the stove, and the family gathering together as another ordinary dinner began. Because in the end, the real secret was never hidden inside one magical ingredient. It lived inside thousands of ordinary days, where breakfast was prepared before sunrise. Vegetables were peeled with patient hands. Bread was baked with familiar recipes. Leftovers were treasured instead of wasted. And every meal reflected gratitude for simple food honestly prepared. Those quiet kitchens may belong to another era, but their gentle lessons still echo across time, reminding us that some of history's greatest wisdom was never spoken aloud. It was simply lived, one humble meal at a time, in homes where nourishment came not only from what was placed on the plate, but from the steady rhythm of everyday life itself. And perhaps, after spending so much time wandering through these peaceful kitchens, we arrive at the quietest lesson of all. The women of the 1950s did not wake each morning, wondering how to lose 5 pounds before summer, or searching for the newest eating plan in a magazine. Most simply focused on feeding their families with the ingredients they had, stretching the household budget as far as possible, and making sure nothing useful was wasted. Ironically, that practical approach often produced eating habits that modern nutrition experts continue to admire. The first stop after returning home from the market was often the pantry. Potatoes were placed in a cool cupboard away from sunlight. Onions were stored separately so they would last longer. Apples were arranged carefully in wooden crates or bowls where bruised fruit could be noticed before it spoiled. Flour was poured into airtight containers to keep it fresh, while dried beans and rice waited patiently for future meals. Every ingredient had a proper place, and that organization made everyday cooking feel almost effortless. Another forgotten kitchen companion was the simple apron. It protected dresses from flour and splashes while quietly becoming part of the daily routine. Once tied around the waist, it almost signaled that the work of preparing meals had begun. Generations of women stirred soups, kneaded bread, peeled vegetables, and baked pies while wearing these practical garments that eventually became symbols of home itself. Many women also preferred serving vegetables in their natural forms. Carrots were sliced into coins, potatoes were baked in their skins, peas were gently steamed, and cabbage was shredded by hand. Meals celebrated recognizable ingredients, instead of disguising them beneath thick layers of sauce. Even children grew familiar with the natural appearance and flavor of vegetables because they appeared so often. Fresh herbs continued to bring quiet elegance to ordinary dinners. A handful of chopped parsley transformed mashed potatoes, dill brightened cucumbers, thyme gently scented roasted vegetables, while rosemary added warmth to baked meats. These herbs required only a small corner of the garden, but provided months of fresh flavor throughout the growing season. One interesting custom involved preparing extra soup. Whenever possible, a large pot might feed the family on Monday evening, provide lunch on Tuesday, and still leave enough for Wednesday. The flavor often improved overnight as the ingredients continued blending together. Soup represented patience rewarded, proving that simple food sometimes became even better with time. Even ordinary drinking glasses tell part of the story. Compared with many modern glasses, they were noticeably smaller. A serving of milk, water, or juice naturally contained less, simply because the glass itself held less. Nobody spoke about portion control. The dishes quietly provided it. Many kitchens also contained clocks that gently ticked throughout the day, reminding everyone that meals followed a dependable schedule. Breakfast before work, lunch around noon, dinner in the early evening. This rhythm gave structure not only to eating but to daily life itself. Knowing another meal was always approaching reduced the temptation to snack constantly. Fresh eggs remained one of the household's most dependable ingredients. Whether scrambled with herbs, boiled for salads, baked into casseroles, or served beside toast, eggs demonstrated remarkable versatility. Affordable, nourishing, and easy to prepare, they quietly appeared throughout the week without attracting much attention. The neighborhood itself also shaped eating habits. Children walked to school. Mothers often walked to nearby shops. Friends visited one another on foot. Gardens required tending. Laundry hung outdoors. Floors were swept by hand. Windows were cleaned regularly. These ordinary tasks added gentle movement throughout the day, complementing the balanced meals prepared in the kitchen. Many women developed favorite mixing bowls, wooden spoons, and cast iron skillets that remained in daily use for decades. These trusted tools became almost like old friends, helping prepare thousands of family meals without ever needing the latest kitchen gadgets. Their worn handles and polished surfaces quietly reflected years of faithful service. Another charming detail was the afternoon fruit plate. Instead of opening a packet of biscuits or candy, someone might slice an apple, peel an orange, or share a handful of grapes while taking a short break. Fruit satisfied the desire for sweetness without becoming a complicated decision. Fresh corn during late summer often moved from garden to dinner table within hours. Tomatoes were picked only when fully ripe. Cucumbers remained cool after soaking in fresh water. Lettuce was harvested moments before being washed for salad. These vegetables tasted remarkably vibrant because they were enjoyed at their natural peak, rather than travelling thousands of miles before reaching the kitchen. As electric appliances gradually became more common, they certainly reduced some of the physical effort involved in cooking. Refrigerators improved food storage, electric mixers saved time, and modern ovens offered greater convenience. Yet despite these helpful inventions, most meals still depended on fresh ingredients and patient preparation, rather than highly processed shortcuts. Looking across the entire decade, it becomes difficult to separate the foods from the lifestyle that surrounded them. Oatmeal mattered because it replaced sugary breakfasts. Vegetable soup mattered because it encouraged slower eating. Apples mattered because they replaced processed snacks. Homemade bread mattered because families understood exactly what went into every loaf. None of these foods worked alone together. They formed a quiet pattern that gently supported health over many years. Perhaps the true mystery was never why so many women stayed slim. Perhaps the greater mystery is how easily later generations drifted away from so many of these simple habits without even noticing. As supermarkets expanded, advertising intensified, convenience foods multiplied, and life became increasingly hurried. Many of those peaceful routines slowly faded into memory. Yet if you listen carefully, it almost feels as though those old kitchens still have something to say. They remind us that nourishment does not always arrive with bright packaging or bold promises. Sometimes it comes in the form of a steaming bowl of soup shared on a rainy evening. Sometimes it is a crisp apple picked from a nearby orchard, a slice of homemade bread cooling on the counter, or fresh green beans gathered from the garden before supper. Sometimes the healthiest meals are also the quietest ones. And so, as we gently close the kitchen door on our journey through the 1950s, we leave behind more than recipes. We leave behind a way of living where food was prepared with patience, eaten with gratitude, shared with family, and remembered with affection. The counters have been wiped clean. Tomorrow's vegetables wait in the pantry. The fruit bowl remains full beneath the soft glow of the kitchen light, and somewhere a loaf of bread still releases the comforting aroma of a day well spent. In that peaceful silence rests the final answer to our question. The unspoken foods that helped many women remain slim were never extraordinary at all. They were simply real, seasonal, modest, and lovingly prepared, small, ordinary gifts repeated every day until they quietly became a lifetime of healthy habits. As the final pages of this quiet story unfold, imagine one last evening in an ordinary American home, sometime in the late 1950s outside. The street has grown peaceful. A few children ride their bicycles home before sunset. Neighbors exchange friendly waves from their front porches, and the distant sound of a lawnmower slowly fades into the evening air. Inside the kitchen, the day's final meal has already been served. The plates are nearly empty, not because they were overflowing to begin with, but because every portion was carefully planned. There is enough left for tomorrow's lunch, but very little that will eventually find its way into the rubbish bin. Waste was something families worked hard to avoid, and that quiet respect for food shaped nearly every meal they prepared. The tablecloth is gently folded after dinner, crumbs are brushed into the sink, and the chairs are pushed neatly beneath the table. These simple routines mark the end of another ordinary day, one that would have seemed completely unremarkable to the people living it. Yet to us, decades later, it offers a fascinating glimpse into a world where healthy eating happened almost by accident, supported by countless everyday habits, rather than complicated rules. Many women also believed that cooking was a skill that improved through repetition rather than perfection. A loaf of bread might rise a little higher one week than the next. A soup might need another pinch of herbs. A pie crust could become flakier after years of practice. There was no expectation that every meal would be flawless. What mattered was preparing wholesome food with care, learning from experience, and serving it with generosity. Even the kitchen window tells part of the story. A small pot of parsley grows on the windowsill. Fresh mint catches the afternoon sunlight. Outside, perhaps a few tomato plants continue ripening in the garden, while climbing beans sway gently in the breeze. These tiny details remind us that fresh ingredients often began only a few steps from the kitchen door. Another overlooked habit involved using every season to its fullest. During spring, women welcomed tender greens after the long winter months. Summer became a celebration of fresh vegetables and juicy fruit. Autumn was devoted to preserving, baking, and preparing for colder weather. Winter encouraged warming stews and hearty soups that filled both the stomach and the home with comfort. Each season naturally brought balance, because the menu changed alongside the landscape. The grocery bill itself often reflected thoughtful choices. Expensive cuts of meat were purchased less frequently, while affordable ingredients such as beans, potatoes, carrots, onions, cabbage, oats, eggs, and seasonal produce formed the foundation of everyday meals. These simple foods quietly provided lasting nourishment without attracting much attention. Many families also treated Sunday afternoon as a time for baking. Bread, biscuits, pies, cakes, or cookies filled the kitchen with comforting aromas, while children played nearby or helped stir batter. Baking became more than preparing food. It became part of family life, creating memories that remained long after the final slice had disappeared. Fresh milk remained one of the kitchen's most dependable staples. It was poured over oatmeal, added to mashed potatoes, stirred into soups, baked into puddings, and served alongside breakfast or supper. Before flavoured coffees and sugary milkshakes became everyday habits, plain milk quietly supported countless family meals. Another charming detail appears in many family photographs from the decade. Dinner tables were rarely crowded with dozens of dishes. Instead, there might be one roast, a bowl of potatoes, 2 vegetables, a basket of bread, butter, and perhaps a simple dessert waiting in the kitchen. The modest arrangement reflected confidence that good food did not need endless variety to be satisfying. Children often learned patience through food. If cookies had been baked for Sunday's gathering, they waited until Sunday. If peaches were still ripening on the windowsill, they waited another day. If soup was simmering, everyone waited until dinner. Delayed gratification quietly became part of everyday life without needing a special name. Many women also developed an instinctive understanding of seasonal abundance. When tomatoes were plentiful, they appeared in salads, soups, sandwiches, and preserves. When apples filled orchards, pies, applesauce, and baked apples followed naturally. The kitchen worked with nature instead of expecting nature to work on demand. Perhaps one of the greatest differences was the emotional relationship people had with food. Meals certainly brought comfort, celebration, and joy, but they were rarely expected to solve loneliness, boredom, frustration, or stress. A difficult day might end with a comforting bowl of soup, shared with family rather than a night of endless snacking alone. Food remained meaningful without carrying every emotional burden. Looking back now, it is tempting to imagine that there must have been one remarkable ingredient responsible for the slim figures so often associated with the decade. Yet, the deeper we explore, the more that idea quietly disappears. The answer was never hidden inside grapefruit. Cabbage soup, oatmeal, cottage cheese, apples, or homemade bread alone. Those foods mattered because they belonged to a much larger pattern. A pattern built from routine, moderation, patience, movement, and respect for simple ingredients. The women of the 1950s probably would have found today's endless nutrition debates rather surprising. They did not count every calorie, measure every gram, or search constantly for miracle foods. Instead, they relied on habits learned through experience, family traditions passed down across generations, and a practical understanding that wholesome meals prepared regularly would take care of most nutritional needs. As darkness settles outside the kitchen window, tomorrow quietly begins taking shape. Potatoes remain in the pantry. Flour waits patiently for the next loaf of bread. Apples fill the fruit bowl, their skins glowing softly beneath the warm kitchen light somewhere. Dried beans soak overnight inside a large bowl, ready to become tomorrow's soup. These are not dramatic scenes, and perhaps that is exactly why they matter. History often remembers great battles, famous leaders, and remarkable inventions, yet ordinary kitchens quietly shaped the daily lives of millions without attracting headlines. Within those modest rooms, women prepared meals that nourished families, stretched household budgets, reduced waste, and unintentionally created eating habits that many people still admire today. So, as we gently leave this peaceful decade behind, one image remains clearer than all the others. A quiet kitchen at the end of the day, the scent of fresh bread lingering in the air, a pot of soup cooling on the stove, vegetables neatly arranged for tomorrow's dinner, a bowl of seasonal fruit waiting on the table, and a homemaker switching off the kitchen light before heading to bed, knowing that another ordinary day of simple cooking will begin again with tomorrow's sunrise. It is a humble ending, but perhaps it is the most fitting one, because the real story of the unspoken foods that helped many 1950s women remain slim was never about extraordinary recipes or forgotten miracles. It was about ordinary mornings, ordinary afternoons, and ordinary evenings filled with real food, steady routines, grateful hearts, and patient hands. Those quiet habits, repeated thousands of times across countless homes, became the true recipe that history almost forgot. A recipe written not with complicated instructions, but with the simple rhythm of everyday life.